The Monkees didn't do too badly for themselves, given that they were created as a TV sitcom response to the Beatles, but the Monkees haven't always been blessed with good fortune despite their celebrity. Here's the tragic, real-life story of the Monkees. The success of the Beatles movies, A Hard Day's Night and Help, inspired a group of TV producers to do something similar with an American sitcom. That's how the Monkees were born. The members didn't come together the way bands traditionally do. They auditioned and were selected, not especially for their musical talent, but for TV-friendly qualities like charisma, good looks, and acting skills. Yet band members Michael Naismith and Peter Tork were accomplished musicians, and Mickey Dolenz and Davy Jones also had decent musical chops. The show was conceived like any sitcom. The actors would play characters, and the music was to be strictly pre-recorded, with the band only providing vocals. After the band released its first single and played a few shows, it became clear that they were more than just actors. Even so, the Monkees were never able to shake their less-than-iconic origin story. They became fairly universally known as the Prefab Four, a play on the Beatles' nickname the Fab Four. In January 1967, Peter Tork and Michael Naismith were upset when they listened to their second album, More of the Monkees, and discovered that it was nothing but recycled music from the show. According to AllMusic, the group finally decided to take a stand, demanding creative control. The Monkees were enough of a sensation that the producers couldn't just fire them and replace them with more agreeable performers. So they capitulated, fired the show's music coordinator, and the Monkees finally became the real band that critics had for so long accused them of not being. Creative freedom also meant freedom to disagree, and the band's autonomy also ended up showcasing creative differences. Their third and fourth albums were commercial and artistic successes, but the fifth, The Birds, the Bees, and the Monkees, was starting to feel a little disjointed. Also around that time, the television series was canceled. The band wasn't happy with the sitcom format and thought it should be more of a variety show. The network, in turn, decided to just axe the whole thing. Success in music depends a lot on the preferences of your audience. Success in movies depends on other factors, such as screenwriting, plot, and making enough sense to avoid turning off your fan base. The Monkees' 1968 feature film, Head, failed on pretty much all of those points. According to Night Flight, Jack Nicholson wrote the screenplay, but even that didn't do much to recommend it, because Nicholson was a B-movie actor no one had ever heard of at the time. The band brainstormed the film while high at a party. Then Nicholson strung the ideas together into a screenplay while on LSD. The finished movie was a weird, plotless, disjointed commentary on everything from consumerism to media deception to police brutality to the exploitation of tragedy. It was also a self-deprecating jab at the Monkees themselves. It was poorly advertised, audiences that did see it were confused, and it was a flop. Of course, Head is now a cult favorite and is mostly well-liked by modern critics, but it was both the beginning and end of the Monkees' film career. Peter Tork seemed especially deflated by the failure of Head. In a 2011 interview with The Guardian, he said, "The simile of a rock in the water is too mild for how badly that movie did." Tork soon left the band. The three remaining members stuck it out for another couple albums, but failed to generate any new hits. According to AllMusic, toward the end of 1969, Naismith called it quits too. He'd already released a solo album and wanted to go it alone. Jones and Dolenz recorded a final album, but the two-man version of the Monkees was not what the band had once been. The band officially broke up after that 1970 album. The Monkees ended not with a bang, but a fizzle.
Peter quit first, Mike quit second. Davey and I just kept going until nobody offered us any more money.
After the Monkees broke up, Peter Tork formed a band called Release, which ironically dissolved before it was able to release a single record. He also attempted to start a production company, but No Trouble reported that enterprise also went nowhere. Tork struggled throughout the 1970s. His money ran out, he was forced to rent his home to a friend to avoid foreclosure, and he ended up moving with his pregnant girlfriend into the basement of David Crosby of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. He was also arrested for possession of hashish and had to spend 3 months in an Oklahoma penitentiary. Tork eventually moved away from the music industry altogether. He took a job teaching high school classes and coaching baseball. Ultimately, he had difficulty with the structure of the school system and was fired. Fortunately, Tork was able to turn things around when he quit drinking in the early 80s. He stopped taking drugs not long after that and was finally able to revitalize his music career. But it was a long, hard road to get there. Most Americans go out of their way to make sure they never ever have to deal with the IRS apart from sending them a tax return on April 15th. But Michael Naismith ended up spending a lot more time with the agency than he wanted. In his 2017 memoir, he wrote that the dissolution of the Monkees was followed almost immediately by the descent of the taxman. He wrote, "The IRS showed up with a huge bill for unpaid taxes and started seizing property. After his whirlwind rise to fame, he was pretty much left with nothing to show for it. After the IRS took all his stuff, Naismith's marriage collapsed and he dealt with the emotional blow in the most toxic way possible. He had an affair with the wife of a friend." In his memoir, he lamented that he was basically at a career and personal rock bottom. "I had no opportunities as an actor, a player, a singer, a songwriter, or a producer." It wasn't all bad for Naismith, though. Not only was he heir to the liquid paper fortune, he literally was the creator of MTV. Mickey Dolenz also spent a lot of years doing not very much of anything. For a while, his resume's main selling point was not his success as an actor, which predated the Monkees by nearly a decade, or his vocal talents. It was that he was one of the Monkees. That notoriety earned him some small television roles and a few voice acting credits on cartoons like Scooby-Doo and Captain Caveman. At one time, he was neck and neck with Henry Winkler for the role of Fonzie on Happy Days, but that opportunity also passed him by. He told Guitar World, "I remember when Henry first walked into the interview. He saw me and said, 'Oh crap, Mickey Dolenz is here, I'll never get it.' But I'm so glad he did because he was a much better Fonz than I would have been." Dolenz didn't flounder for long. By 1976, he was headed to the UK to star in a musical, and plans to stay for 3 months eventually morphed into a 12-year career as a director and producer. With the power of MTV and with help from others in their orbit, Dolenz, Jones, and Tork got together for a 20th anniversary Monkees reunion tour in 1986 that exploded into an unexpectedly huge hit. By the 1990s, the former Monkees were all off doing their own things, but the 30th anniversary was approaching. According to AllMusic, the band got together to talk about the impending anniversary, discovered they still had some musical chemistry, and recorded a new album. The 1996 album Justice became the first Monkees record written and produced entirely by Naismith, Tork, Jones, and Dolenz. When the band decided to start touring again, all of their creative differences and personal animosities started to resurface. Naismith dropped out of the tour early on, and the remaining band members weren't quiet about how that made them feel. The remaining 3 toured again in 2001, but this time it was Tork who abandoned ship, although Jones and Dolenz said they fired him. Tork later complained that Jones and Dolenz drank so much on the tour that they became mean and abusive. But it wasn't just Tork clashing with Jones and Dolenz. Evidently, Jones and Dolenz weren't getting along swimmingly either. In a 2009 interview, Jones said he couldn't imagine sharing a stage with Mickey Dolenz ever again. Ouch. Things weren't going awesomely for Michael Naismith either. In 2010, Naismith's wife left him, and in the middle of all of that emotional turmoil, he started to go blind. Naismith wrote in his 2017 memoir Infinite Tuesday, an autobiographical riff, "I lost my sight to cataracts and at the same time lost my flexibility to an undiagnosed condition that crippled me, making it difficult and painful to walk. I was essentially helpless, a captive in my home." Fortunately, Naismith's blindness was reversible. Cataract surgery restored his sight, but his strange crippling illness was more difficult to overcome because no one knew what it was. The illness left him largely unable to use his left hand, and his right foot was useless enough that he had to drag it when he walked. The specialists he visited mostly just scratched their heads and offered him pain medication. The good news is that the illness, whatever it was, eventually went away on its own. Naismith, a Christian Scientist, believes prayer and medication cured him. The Monkees got together once again in 2011 and went on tour, only without Michael Naismith, who by then had inherited his liquid paper fortune. The 45th anniversary tour actually went shockingly well for rockers clearly past their prime, though after a summer of traveling around North America, the band members, who were all well into their 60s, chose not to add more dates to the tour. Then in February of the following year, Davy Jones died of a heart attack. Jones's death shocked everyone who knew him. A business associate told CNN he was a vegetarian and there was not an ounce of fat on the guy. He lived on the beach in Florida and ran miles every morning. He couldn't have been in better shape. That finally was the end of the Monkees as a foursome, but Michael Naismith joined the remaining 2 Monkees for a short set of reunion performances, each of which featured a tribute to their fallen bandmate. In February 2019, the Monkees took their most recent blow. Peter Tork finally succumbed to the rare form of head and neck cancer he'd been battling for a decade. Torque was first diagnosed with adenoid cystic carcinoma in 2009. 2 years later, he told Rolling Stone that the surgery he'd undergone to remove the cancer had been a success. He wrote, "My checkups have been clear ever since. I'm excruciatingly lucky. I count my blessings every day." Cancer doctors will always hesitate to say cancer is cured, and for good reason. It can come back even years after it's disappeared, and when it does, it's often resistant to the treatments that took it down the first time. After Torque's death, the two remaining Monkees posted heartfelt messages in their bandmate's honor. Naismith was especially profound. He wrote, "It's going to be a rough day. I share with all Monkees fans this change, this loss. Even so, PT will be a part of me forever, and the Monkees will be part of us."
Over the last 5 decades, the members of Fleetwood Mac have weathered a bevy of tumultuous relationships and numerous changes of staff. Despite selling over 100 million records, sudden upheaval has become standard for Fleetwood Mac. Here's the tragic, real-life story of Fleetwood Mac. The original Fleetwood Mac was formed in 1967 in England with Mick Fleetwood, John McVie, and Peter Green, all former members of John Mayall's Blues Breakers. It was Green who wrote the band's first major hit, Black Magic Woman, and Green who decided to change the band's name from Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac to just Fleetwood Mac. In 1970, Green left the band as his drug addiction and frequent LSD use took a toll on his mental state. Fortunately for the rest of the band, John McVie's wife, Christine, a talented singer-songwriter in her own right, stepped up and joined the group. More major personnel changes soon followed. Original guitarist Jeremy Spencer left in 1971, as did guitarist Danny Kerwin in 1972 after a backstage brawl with fellow guitarist Bob Welch. In 1973, a third guitarist, Dave Walker, was fired after Fleetwood decided he wasn't a good fit for the band. In those days, being a guitarist in Fleetwood Mac was like being a drummer in Spinal Tap. The addition of Christine McVie was a welcome boost to Fleetwood Mac, but trouble was brewing elsewhere. Mick Fleetwood suffered the first of the band's romantic heartbreaks in 1973 when guitarist Bob Weston had an affair with Fleetwood's wife, Jenny Boyd. Weston remained with the band until the end of their 1973 tour. The guitarist's troubles didn't end there. Bob Welch, a band member since 1971, could no longer handle the long hours or his budding drinking problem, and quit in late 1974. Desperate to find stable, talented musicians who could bring their skills to the table, Fleetwood Mac began looking around for a new guitarist. When Fleetwood finally found the player he was looking for in Lindsey Buckingham. He also found a new singer in Buckingham's girlfriend, a young songwriter named Stevie Nicks. In the mid-1970s, Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham were struggling singer-songwriters and lovers just trying to get by in Los Angeles. The release of their debut album as a duo, 1973's Buckingham Nicks, was a financial disappointment, but they hadn't yet given up on their dreams. While touring a California recording studio, Mick Fleetwood heard their music and asked who the guitar player was. Eager to replace Bob Welch, Fleetwood got in touch with Buckingham and offered him a spot as Fleetwood Mac's new guitarist. Buckingham came back with a counteroffer.
I just said, well, Stevie and I are package deal.
After Nicks listened to every of the previous Fleetwood Mac albums and agreed there was potential there, she and Buckingham joined the band. Fleetwood Mac quickly went into the studio to record their first album with the new lineup. Titled simply Fleetwood Mac, the album produced the band's first ever #1 hit, Nick's mystical story song, Rhiannon. Fleetwood Mac was suddenly one of the biggest bands in the world, but they would soon get even bigger. As Fleetwood Mac skyrocketed to fame, the band's personal lives were quickly disintegrating. Nick's relationship with Buckingham grew strained, and Christine and John McVie began having problems of their own. By 1976, both couples were split up, and at one point Nicks even had an affair with Fleetwood. Even as all of this drama unfolded though, the band was still working to make a new record. Fleetwood Mac poured all of their behind-the-scenes drama into their next album, Rumours. Released in 1977, Rumours is still considered one of the greatest breakup albums of all time. Songs like Dreams, Go Your Own Way, Secondhand News, and other hits were direct products of the band's failed relationships. Rumours shot to number 1 and stayed on the charts for 353 weeks. Nearly 7 years. Even as they were falling apart personally, professionally, Fleetwood Mac was the biggest band in the world. The success of Rumours left Fleetwood Mac reeling. Despite the album's acclaim, personal problems and drug use ravaged and exhausted the band as they toured the world. Then it was time to make another album, under the weight of the massive expectations set up by Rumours. The band's follow-up, a double album called Tusk, finally arrived in 1979. Tusk sold well, but it couldn't live up to the success of Rumours, in part because of its more experimental sound. In an effort to revive the feelings behind Rumours, the band released a live album featuring many of their biggest hits in 1980. Some of the old magic was still there, but as the 80s dawned, Fleetwood Mac's frontwoman was eager to go her own way. In the early 1980s, after completing work on Tusk, Stevie Nicks had enough allure on her own to begin a solo career. Nicks' first solo album, Belladonna, was a number 1 hit in 1981. Buckingham also went solo in 1981 with his album Law and Order, but Stevie was without a doubt the biggest solo presence. Driven by hits like Edge of 17, her album made her a massive star in her own right. Fleetwood Mac came together again to produce the Mirage album in 1982. Nicks appeared on the album as she worked on her own new record, The Wild Heart, which arrived the following year and produced more hits. Even as her solo career was thriving though, Nicks' personal life was full of heartbreak. She made news when she married Kim Anderson, the widowed husband of her lifelong friend Robin, who had died of leukemia. 2 days before Robin's death, doctors were forced to remove her 6.5-month-old son Matthew from her womb. Driven by grief and a desire to be a mother to Matthew in memory of her friend, Nicks married Anderson. By the mid-1980s, Stevie Nicks was still struggling personally and professionally. Her 1985 album Rock a Little was only a modest success compared to her previous releases, and she was battling drug and alcohol addiction. By 1986, Nicks had checked into the Betty Ford Center to seek treatment. Meanwhile, both Christine McVie and Lindsey Buckingham pursued solo projects. In 1984, McVie released a self-titled album that produced the hit Got a Hold on Me. In 1983, Buckingham had a hit with the song Holiday Road from the National Lampoon's Vacation soundtrack, and the next year released his second solo album, Go Insane. After years of working around their solo projects and personal issues, Fleetwood Mac finally released a new album in 1987. Tango in the Night was their biggest hit since Rumours, driven by singles like Little Lies and Big Love. But drama soon followed the success. Though she'd recovered from her cocaine addiction, Nicks developed an addiction to the tranquilizer Klonopin. Then, as the band prepared to tour to promote Tango in the Night, Buckingham decided to quit Fleetwood Mac. The band hired guitarist Rick Vito and Billy Burnett to replace Buckingham for the upcoming tour, but it was still the end of an era.
We just couldn't work together anymore.
In 1990, after Buckingham's departure, Fleetwood Mac produced Behind the Mask, the first real flop since the beginning of the Rumours era. Nicks left the band shortly after the album's release to work on solo projects and get her addictions under control. That struggle reached a turning point in 1993 when Fleetwood Mac's classic lineup briefly reunited to perform Don't Stop at President Bill Clinton's inauguration. Appearing in the national spotlight again helped motivate Nicks to kick her old habits once and for all. In 1995, the remaining members of Fleetwood Mac joined with Traffic guitarist Dave Mason and country singer Becca Bramlett to release Time. It was the first Fleetwood Mac album since 1974 to feature no major contributions from Buckingham or Nicks, and remains a mostly forgotten footnote in the band's history. Before long, Fleetwood Mac would realize that what fans really wanted was another reunion. After the disappointing release of Time, Fleetwood Mac found itself at a crossroads. New hope for some old magic was sparked when Fleetwood joined Buckingham for some studio sessions for a solo project.
Suddenly, there we were in the studio saying, gee, this feels pretty good. Isn't that weird?
The Rumours lineup of Fleetwood Mac officially reunited in 1997 for a live show that would become the album and concert film The Dance. The Dance was a massive success, launching a tour and producing a radio hit with Nick's song Silver Springs. In 1998, the band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but the success of its most popular lineup was short-lived. That same year, Christine McVie announced that she was leaving Fleetwood Mac during one of its most successful periods. McVie explained that it was truly nothing personal, but she developed a fear of flying that made touring difficult. Plus, she simply wanted to settle down into a life that wasn't dominated by constant travel. The Dance got fans excited for the possibility of a new Fleetwood Mac album, but with McVie's departure, that was once again in jeopardy. After Christine McVie's departure, both Buckingham and Nicks returned to work on solo projects. Nicks released the successful solo album Trouble in Shangri-La in 2001, and Buckingham went to work on a solo album he'd been developing since before The Dance. It was while he was in the midst of that solo work that an offer to make a new Fleetwood Mac album emerged. Nicks, Buckingham, Fleetwood, and John McVie gathered together to make Say You Will, the first Fleetwood Mac album headlined by Buckingham and Nicks since Tango in the Night. The album was a financial success, but it was also the first Mac record made without Christine McVie since 1970, and her absence was felt. It was also not made without drama. The resulting creative clashes were covered in the documentary Destiny Rules. Despite these issues, Fleetwood Mac went back on the road to promote Say You Will and continued to tour off and on for the next decade without McVie. Though the band was showing its age a bit, Fleetwood Mac soldiered on. They self-released 4 new songs under the title Extended Play in 2013, and in 2014, Christine McVie announced that she was ready to rejoin the band for a major tour with the Rumours era lineup. The reunion was successful, and in 2017, Christine McVie and Buckingham released an album of duets together. Everything was rosy again. Or was it? At this point, we're guessing you know the answer. In January of 2018, Fleetwood Mac came together to be honoured as the Person of the Year by the Music Cares Foundation. While the band performed well together, tensions were high behind the scenes. According to Fleetwood and Nicks, Buckingham was resisting an upcoming tour the band had been planning and wouldn't budge. It was clear that if the band was touring again, it would be without their lead guitarist.
It became just a huge impasse and hit a brick wall, where we decided that we had to part company.
Buckingham fought back and claimed that Nicks had threatened that she would leave Fleetwood Mac if Buckingham wasn't dismissed. Buckingham filed suit against the band, claiming breach of contract, and later said he thought Nicks had staged some kind of coup to get him to leave. By the end of 2018, the suit was settled out of court.
I'm happy enough with it. I'm not out there trying to twist the knife at all.
With Buckingham gone, the band again picked up 2 new members, Mike Campbell of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers and Neil Finn of Crowded House. The band embarked on a successful tour that lasted through 2019, and they may one day hit the road again. While Buckingham thinks his days with Fleetwood Mac are over, the band itself is constantly evolving through good times and bad. If there's one thing you can say about Fleetwood Mac, it's that they're survivors.
Toto may not be the most successful or well-loved rock band in the world, but their story is unlike that of any other. For a while, Toto actually ruled the airwaves, but sadly their sunshine days were all too brief. Beyond that, the rest of the band's history is riddled with discord and tragedy. Here's the long, strange, and tragic real-life story of Toto. Many people like to say that a close friend is like their brother, but they tend to forget just how often brothers fight. Just ask Toto. When drummer Jeff Porcaro co-founded the band, he quickly asked his brother keyboardist Steve Porcaro to join in. After original bassist Dave Hungate left the group in 1982, another one of those Porcaros, Mike, jumped from occasional Toto cellist to full-time Toto bassist. But that combination was a bubbling cauldron overflowing with searing hot animosity and resentment. Speaking about the band's early days, Steve later told Classic Rock, "I felt undervalued. Jeff and I were always at each other's throats. Mike got along with both of us, but Jeff and me really bumped heads." Although we recalled Jeff getting frustrated if Steve couldn't reach his perfecting standards, he claimed there was definitely something brotherly going on, since he'd hear Jeff singing Steve's praises whenever he thought his brother wasn't around. There's a strange phenomenon in the music world in which some of the most hated bands inexplicably reach the very highest levels of commercial success. They can sell tens of millions of records and win endless accolades for their work, but still, for some reason or another, they seem to be universally despised. Let's just call it the Nickelback paradox. Toto are cursed with this paradox too. The band's 1982 album Toto 4 spawned two of the most popular radio hits of all time in Rosanna and Africa, which went to number 2 and number 1 in the Billboard Hot 100 respectively. In 1983, the Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences bestowed multiple Grammy Awards on the very popular band, including Album of the Year, Producer of the Year, and Record of the Year for Rosanna. Despite all that, however, Toto struggled to be respected in the industry. Critics already couldn't stand the band. For example, Rolling Stone labeled Toto 4 about as real as a Velveeta orange polyester leisure suit. Meanwhile, Robert Hilburn of the Los Angeles Times claimed there was a disheartening lack of depth or daring in the group's music. Toto's David Paich once shot back at the band's enemies, telling People magazine, "Critics are just fools with no credentials or credibility."
I think we've grown to mature to know that if you've been in a band for 10 years like Toto has, that you're going to be picked on by critics.
The band didn't just talk the talk either. Band member Steve Lukather later told the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, "We're the only band in history to turn down the cover of Rolling Stone. We knew they were going to do a hatchet job on us." Like many of the world's most popular bands, Toto split lead vocal duties among its members. But although many of Toto's members took their turns behind the microphone from time to time, it was Bobby Kimball who served as the band's primary singer for its first 4 albums in the late 70s and early 80s. As it happened, the late 70s and early 80s were also a time of widespread cocaine use, perhaps more so than any other era in rock and roll. Band member Steve Lukather told Classic Rock that while Toto dipped into the white stuff back in the day, it wasn't all that big a deal. He said, "We were not the only band that did blow. We weren't as bad as most, but thanks to Mr. Kimball, that became like our badge of honor." In other words, Kimball was doing too much coke, so much so that Toto's Steve Porcaro says it ruined his voice. He later said, "The bottom line was Bobby couldn't sing. I stayed up all night. We all did. The next day my throat would be like ribbons, but I didn't have to sing. Bobby had to, and he just wasn't delivering." And so, in 1983, right after its peak of commercial success, the other members of Toto elected to fire Kimball, right around the same time that Kimball also went on trial for a 1981 incident in which he allegedly sold 4 ounces of cocaine to an undercover cop. As it turned out, Bobby Kimball's distinctive vocal stylings were a key part of Toto's sound and appeal. After he was forced out of the band, Toto's fortunes took a steep downturn. While Toto 4 peaked at number 4 on the Billboard album chart, won a number of Grammys, and went multi-platinum, the group's 1984 follow-up Isolation stalled at number 42. It's often tough to replace the lead singer of an established band, and it was a heck of a tall order for Kimball's immediate successor, Dennis "Fergie" Fredrickson. A veteran singer with the likes of rock bands like Trillion, Survivor, and La Rue, Fergie certainly had the chops and experience to roll with Toto, but it just didn't work out. He left the band after Isolation, replaced by singer Joseph Williams. Sadly, in June 2010, Fredrickson announced that he'd been diagnosed with an inoperable form of cancer. Less than 4 years later, the former Toto singer died at age 62. It's a rare band in which the leader is the drummer, seeing as how they're stuck behind a mass of snares and hi-hats at the far back of the stage. But they do exist. Fleetwood Mac was definitely Mick Fleetwood's baby. Later Day Genesis was drummer Phil Collins' vehicle, and coming in a respectable third on that shortlist, Toto was Jeff Porcaro's band all the way. He formed the band in the first place, and bandmate Steve Lukather would later label him Toto's figurehead. So it was understandably devastating to the band when Porcaro suddenly died in August 1992 at the age of 38.
To know Jeff was to love him. Those his friends who knew him, still miss him very much, and always will.
Just what caused a seemingly healthy, relatively young guy to drop dead depends entirely on who you're talking to. According to a story published in the Los Angeles Times on August 7, 1992, Porcaro was working in his yard in the San Fernando Valley, spraying plants with pesticide when he fell ill. By the time emergency workers arrived, he wasn't breathing, had no pulse, and his heart had stopped. After briefly reviving him, authorities transported Porcaro to the hospital where he was pronounced dead. A Los Angeles County coroner spokesman attributed the death to a heart attack caused by an allergic reaction to inhaled pesticide spray, but that's not the end of the story. When the Los Angeles County coroner released its official reports on Porcaro a few weeks later, it ruled Porcaro's cause of death to be occlusive coronary artery disease. In layman's terms, a hardening of the arteries brought on by long-term cocaine use. Tests found no trace of pesticide in Porcaro's system, but they did reveal traces of cocaine along with cocaine byproducts. However, Toto band member Steve Lukather wasn't happy with this conclusion at all and disavowed the coroner's report, as well as the news organizations that went ahead and published it. He later told Classic Rock, "It was irresponsible journalism. They found 1/100th of a microgram of cocaine in Jeff's blood. That's like 2 crystals on a matchstick. That ain't gonna give somebody a heart attack, believe me. The rest of us were doing 100 times more than that, and we all lived to tell the tale." Lukather claims that Porcaro's premature death was brought about by a long-standing heart condition and a smoking habit, though nothing of that ended up in the coroner's report. Lukather suggested, "He was probably smoking a cigarette or a joint. He didn't have gloves on. That's how the chemicals got into his skin." Although Toto topped the charts and dominated rock radio in the early 80s, the band subsequently drifted into semi-obscurity thereafter, the fate of so many artists who were once on top of the world. But that doesn't mean the group disbanded. After the hugely successful Toto 4, the band released 8 studio albums and 4 live albums, a new one arriving in stores every couple of years or so well into the 2000s. Toto stayed an intact touring band for more than 30 years, too, all the way until 2008, which marked the first time the group ever officially disbanded. But by that point, things had become too much for Steve Lukather, so he made the decision to break up the band. As he later told Classic Rock, neither musical nor personnel reasons caused the split. Instead, he needed to end the band to deal with a slew of personal issues. He explained, "I was drinking myself to death. I was losing my marriage. My mother was dying. It was a bad time. I needed to get myself together or I was going to end up killing myself." Happily, Lukather says he soon managed to turn things around. He said, "I quit drinking, went to a shrink, exorcised some demons." Some of the biggest and most influential acts in rock history have been sibling acts, and so was Toto. In 1982, a third Porcaro brother, Mike Porcaro, joined drummer Jeff Porcaro and keyboarder Steve Porcaro in the band. While he'd contributed his cello skills on a few Toto 4 tracks, he became an official member of the group in 1982 after the departure of original bass player David Hungate. And so he stayed, playing bass for Toto on record and on stage all the way until 2007, when he had to quit the band after suffering from some serious health issues. After noticing a numbness in his fingers while playing the bass, Porcaro sought medical treatment, and doctors diagnosed him with ALS, otherwise known as Lou Gehrig's disease, a devastating and ultimately fatal degenerative neural condition that slowly robs the body of its ability to speak, eat, and breathe. After coping with ALS for 8 years, Mike Porcaro died in 2015 at the age of 59. Toto was a band for some 40 years, and with a length of time like that comes a number of natural changes. Band members arrive, band members leave, and people formerly or currently associated with the band fall away. Sadly, an inordinate number of Toto's musicians have died. Luckily, Steve Porcaro is still with us. But that doesn't mean time has left him unscathed. Steve Lukather later explained to Classic Rock that Porcaro had had a tumor removed from his brain that was thankfully benign. Unfortunately, the operation to remove the tumor also called Porcaro to go deaf in his left ear. And while it's certainly wonderful that Porcaro survived the ordeal of a brain tumor, it's also tragic that a man who makes his living from music would be partially robbed of the gift of hearing. Like so many other bands had done before them, the remaining members of Toto's classic lineup reconvened for a 2015 tour, ostensibly in support of Toto 14, their first album in 9 years. But the real reason the band got back out there is a lot more depressing. They had no choice. In 2008, Toto suspected that its label Sony owed them unpaid royalties for digital downloads. An auditor confirmed that notion, and in 2010, the band sued Sony, seeking more than $600,000 in damages. In addition to filing unsuccessfully for dismissal of the suit, Sony then countersued, demanding $500,000 from Toto, who the label said had overpaid in royalties over the years. Unfortunately for the band, in 2014, a judge ruled that the label didn't owe them any money at all. If Toto needed cash before it sued Sony, they certainly needed it after it lost an expensive years-long legal battle. The group then recorded Toto 14, an act Steve Lukather later said was, quote, born out of litigation. He told Smashing Interviews magazine, "When we came through the litigation, all the shit left over from management that screwed us and all the other negatives, we decided to turn the negative into a positive. When we put our minds to do the record, we said that we had to make as good a record as we possibly could with all the tools and all the talent and all the experience we've had, and not just phone it in for a check."
Even when things weren't going particularly really well, man, we hung in there. And now, all these years later, I mean, who knew we'd be sitting here?
If nothing else, you've got to give them props for that.
The Beatles are probably one of mankind's greatest success stories. 4 working-class English lads came together to play music and became the most influential band of all time. While they hit incredible heights, their career was also fraught with difficulty. Here's the Beatles' tragic story. None of the Beatles had particularly easy beginnings, but John Lennon's childhood was especially rough. His father Alfred was barely present during his early years, but the adults who were around, like his mother Julia and his aunt Mimi, were the sources of plenty of conflict. These two women, who were vastly different in both temperament and social status, vied for control of young John for much of his youth. Perhaps the most well-known story about John's childhood took place when he was 5, when his father forced him to choose between him and his mother. John first chose Alfred, but then he ran up the street to his mother in tears when she left. Alfred disappeared after that, and he didn't reappear until after the Beatles found fame. These experiences had an effect on the young Lennon. As a boy, he led gangs, shoplifted, and bullied fellow students and teachers alike. This rebellious streak famously continued into adulthood. While Lennon's childhood was certainly troubled, Ringo Starr's was downright nightmarish. Born Richard Starkey, his father walked out on him when he was just 4. He also fell victim to a host of diseases throughout his childhood, including tuberculosis, which forced him to spend 2 years in a sanatorium. Luckily, things started to look up from there. Starkey's stepfather began to encourage the young boy's interest in music during this time in the sanatorium, and he was given his first drum kit for Christmas in 1957, 2 years after his release. Only a few years later, he joined his first proper band and changed his name to Ringo Starr. Then, while touring in Germany, he met a group of talented young musicians on residency who were calling themselves the Beatles. The Beatles are renowned for leading the so-called British invasion of America, firmly establishing themselves as one of the most successful groups to ever cross the Atlantic. That success, however, didn't come easy. At first, they couldn't even land a contract with their own label's American counterpart. When their music was finally issued in America, they saw very little circulation, and their first imprint in the country even spelled the band's name incorrectly by adding an extra T. The Beatles finally received some American news coverage thanks to a morning segment on CBS. Alas, it aired on November 22, 1963, which is now better remembered as the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Radio DJs in the U.S. managed to get their hands on some British 45s of the songs Please Please Me, From Me to You, and She Loves You, but they initially didn't get any traction with American audiences, with some listeners phoning into stations to try to get them to stop playing the band's music. All that changed in 1964 when I Want to Hold Your Hand hit number 1 on February 1st. 8 days later, the Beatles played the first of their legendary slots on The Ed Sullivan Show and cemented their superstar status throughout America. Compared to some of the raucous rockers who arrived just after them, the Beatles can easily be seen as the do-gooders of 60s pop music. And to an extent, that's actually true. They had some brushes with the law, but most of them were due to their love of soft drugs. Still, that doesn't mean their record was entirely unblemished during their heyday. For example, McCartney and original drummer Pete Best were deported from Germany for setting fire to a condom. The homes of various Beatles were also frequently raided by the police thanks to the efforts of a draconian sergeant named Norman Pilcher, who headed a British drug enforcement group. If that name sounds familiar, you are correct. The name Pilcher made it into the song I Am the Walrus as a sly putdown. But it was the Swedish police who would finally nab a Beatle for drug possession, as Paul and his wife Linda were charged a $2,000 fine for holding marijuana in 1972. The couple would be brought in on the same charge quite a few times over the next few years, including in Japan and Barbados.
I would like to see it decriminalized, because I don't think in the privacy of my own room I was doing anyone any harm whatsoever.
On the night of December 8, 1980, John Lennon and Yoko Ono ate out for dinner near their apartment in New York City. Afterward, they returned home to say goodnight to their 5-year-old son, Sean. They stepped out onto the street, where a man named Mark David Chapman was waiting for them with a .38 handgun. He shot Lennon 4 times in the back. By the time the police arrived, it was too late. Despite the efforts of a team of doctors and nurses, Lennon died just before midnight at a local hospital. The assassination shocked the world. Although Ono declined to hold a funeral for her husband, a wave of mourning took over the world. Tens of thousands gathered in Liverpool and New York to commemorate the late Beatle with a 10-minute silence. The violent death cemented Lennon's status as an icon.
The shooting happened. Does it ever make sense? Is anything like that ever?
No, I mean, it's just a very sudden thing.
In 1997, George Harrison was diagnosed with throat cancer, an illness most likely caused by his many years of smoking. In 2001, he was treated for a brain tumor in Switzerland, and later that year he began radiotherapy treatment in New York for the lung cancer that had spread to his brain. Harrison was a very spiritual man, and according to his close friend, Monty Python comedian Michael Palin, death held no terrors for George at all. He'd got all that worked out. On November 29, 2001, Harrison died at the age of 58 in Los Angeles. He was remembered by McCartney as his, quote, baby brother. Ringo Starr, whose daughter was then undergoing similar treatment for a brain tumor, also visited Harrison in the hospital shortly before his death. With the passing of Harrison, two Beatles now remain, Ringo and Paul, who both continue to tour today.
Rush's songs speak to the mind and the heart. The band also sings from a place of empathy, as its individual members have endured a lot of pain and struggle over the years. Here's the tragic real-life story of Rush. From late 1996 to July 1997, Rush toured in support of its album Test for Echo. And after the final stop in Ottawa, Ontario, drummer Neil Peart headed home to Toronto to see his 19-year-old daughter, Selena Taylor, off to college. Peart wrote in Ghostwriter Travels on the Healing Road that on the morning of August 10, 1997, he hopped on his motorcycle to guide his daughter, who was riding in a car behind him, through the Quebec wilderness. He wrote that they stopped at a gas station and parted ways. Once again, I hugged and kissed her and told her I loved and was proud of her. Now I was so glad those words had been spoken. That's because later that day, Taylor died after being involved in a single-car accident. According to MTV News, Taylor's Jeep rolled over on Highway 401, somewhere between Toronto and Montreal. Jackie Taylor, the mother of Neil Peart's daughter and his partner of more than 2 decades, was understandably devastated by the death of Selena Taylor. Peart wrote, "She just wanted to die. She had to be coaxed into eating anything at all and talked of suicide constantly." In January 1998, Peart and Taylor were beginning to emerge from the haze of grief when Taylor started to suffer from a persistent nighttime cough and serious back pain. However, it wasn't the result of grief-related stress, as Taylor had presumed. Instead, a doctor diagnosed her with terminal cancer. Just a few months later, Taylor passed away after suffering a series of strokes. This personal tragedy was the second loss of a family member that Peart suffered in less than 1 calendar year.
After she passed away, he was lost. And so he ran, he got on his motorcycle and ran.
When a lot of legacy musical acts retire, they let their audiences know and stage a final goodbye tour so they can cash in before disappearing from the public eye. Rush certainly could have made a bundle from a farewell tour, but that wasn't in the cards. In 2018, Geddy Lee told Trunk Nation, quote, "That period of our life is done." The reason? Neil Peart couldn't play the drums to his own very high standard anymore. Lee explained, "Neil is retired. He hasn't just retired from Rush, he's retired from drumming. He's not drumming anymore, and he's living his life, which is fine." The band's R40 tour in 2015 wound up being the band's last, and even then, it was very hard for Peart to get through because of tendinitis, shoulder pain, and a serious foot infection. Lee explained, "Neil was struggling throughout that tour to play at his peak because of physical ailments and other things that were going on with him. And he did not want to go out and do anything less than what people expected of him." While not an original member of Rush, Neil Peart played a huge part in forging the band's identity. Not only was he responsible for 40-plus years of superhuman proficiency and clever drum technique, he also wrote the majority of the band's intelligent and philosophical lyrics. But sadly, health issues forced Peart to quit the band after its 2015 tour. And while Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson discussed teaming up for some musical project down the line, it just wouldn't and couldn't be Rush without Peart. And now there will never be a full Rush reunion. On January 7th, 2020, Peart passed away at the age of 67. A spokesman for Peart's family confirmed the news to Rolling Stone, as well as revealing that Peart had been quietly fighting brain cancer for several years. Rush shared a message on Instagram. "Our friend, soul brother, and bandmate of over 45 years, Neil, has lost his incredibly brave 3.5-year battle with brain cancer." Rush bassist Geddy Lee is one of Canada's finest, born in Toronto in 1953. His parents, Morris Weinrib and Manya Rubinstein, were relatively recent immigrants to the Great White North, both originally from Poland. The pair met and fell for each other in 1939. And as this was Poland under World War II-era Nazi occupation and they were Jewish, that meeting occurred in a work camp. Neither was older than 13, and they were both sent to the notorious Auschwitz concentration camp, where they endured unbelievable horrors for close to 2 years. Then, Weinrib was transferred to Dachau. while Rubinstein remained at Auschwitz before being sent to Bergen-Belsen. After the Allied liberation of the camps, Weinrib set out in search of Rubinstein, eventually finding her at a displaced persons camp and marrying her before moving to Canada. Lee would later say that his first memories were of his mother discussing Hitler in the camps. His father was more reticent to discuss the atrocities and died when Lee was only 12. While it's certainly not as tragic as the rest of these events, Rush's years-long struggle to get respect from the rock and roll mainstream is certainly puzzling and undeserved. At one point, a critic writing for Rolling Stone likened Geddy Lee's voice to a, quote, dog-calling falsetto shriek that floats through the songs like swamp gas. Alex Lifeson explained to Radio.com, "They didn't like us at all at Rolling Stone. In fact, I think it sort of bordered on hate. They were a hip crowd from an early generation."
If they don't appreciate the aesthetics of our music, then they will find it offensive, frankly. And consequently, radio stations do not want to take a chance on playing something like us.
Rolling Stone publisher Jan Winter also headed up the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And despite being eligible for years and being one of the most successful acts ever, Rush couldn't get enshrined. Finally, in 2013, Rush made it in. Lifeson said, "When we were nominated, it came as a bit of a surprise to us because we thought we wouldn't get inducted unless it was over Jan Winter's dead body, but he was still quite alive."
Having faced down poverty, illness, divorce, and the ever-changing taste of the public, Cher continues to beat the odds, winning over generation after generation of fans with her unwavering dedication and endless talent. From her early days to her recent struggles, this is Cher's tragic real-life story. Cher's parents, Georgia Holt and John Sarkeesian, had a short and tumultuous relationship that ended in divorce when Cher was just 10 months old. The singer would know little of her father until Holt briefly reconciled with Sarkeesian when she was 11. Cher's relationship with her father, a struggling gambler and drug addict, was at times volatile and they rarely spoke. Nevertheless, Cher took from her troubled father a deep love and respect for her Armenian heritage. The man whom Cher would consider her real father was Holt's third husband, actor John Southall, but even this marriage failed in the end and Holt and Southall divorced when Cher was 9. In fact, Holt married 7 times in total. In 1978, she told People magazine, "In those days, it wasn't right to sleep with someone if you weren't married, so I ended up getting married a lot."
You have to know that Daddy drilled that into my head because Mother wasn't there. He said, "Don't you ever let a man touch you, ever, 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 unless you're married."
Holt's frequent divorces led to a nomadic and often impoverished lifestyle for young Cher. An aspiring actress and singer, Holt subsisted on bit parts in movies and the occasional singing gig. When Cher was only 2 years old, circumstances became so dire that Holt was forced to place her daughter in the care of a Catholic orphanage for several weeks until she could get on firmer financial footing. In a 2010 cover story, Cher told Vanity Fair of her hardscrabble upbringing. She recalled, "I remember being really ashamed of my clothes. I was so hard on my shoes. I remember going to school with rubber bands around my shoes to keep my soles on." And Holt's occasional inroads to Hollywood made for a sometimes confusing existence. Cher explained, "We ate a can of stew or a can of beans one week, but then sometimes we lived in Beverly Hills. It was a very strange life." In 1963, the 16-year-old Cher left home for Los Angeles, where she met Salvatore "Sonny" Bono, a 27-year-old songwriter and record promoter. Kicked out by her roommates, Cher moved in with Bono, ostensibly in order to work as a housekeeper. Although Bono and Cher initially kept things platonic, a relationship soon developed, both personal and professional. By 1965, Sonny and Cher had found success with the release of their first hit song, "I Got You Babe." A gentle ode to young love against the odds, the song struck a chord with 60s youth culture, catapulting Sonny and Cher to international fame. Sonny and Cher followed "I Got You Babe" with a string of hits, including a re-release of their first single, "Baby Don't Go," and 1967's "The Beat Goes On." Emboldened by their success, the duo attempted to break into the movies with the 1967 comedy Good Times, but the film was a critical and commercial failure. The couple then invested much of their accumulated fortune into the film Chastity, a drama written and produced by Bono as a starring vehicle for Cher. It, too, flopped and brought the couple to the brink of financial ruin. Fate dealt Sonny and Cher yet another blow as shifting tastes made their brand of light, folky pop woefully unhip with youthful audiences, who were turning to a heavier brand of psychedelic music. Now heavily in debt, Sonny and Cher headed for Las Vegas and reinvented themselves as a nightclub act. Ironically, Sonny and Cher's Vegas Lounge act became the key to their return to the pop culture spotlight. Their show relied in equal parts on music and comedy and opened the doors to considerable TV success. Premiering in 1971, the Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour was a ratings hit, but the following year, cracks were beginning to show in their relationship. Although both Cher and Bono indulged in extramarital affairs, Bono's constant womanizing took its toll on Cher. Speaking about her husband, Cher once explained, One woman, or even 5, was not enough for him. Choosing to stay married for business reasons, the couple struggled to maintain their public facade while seeing other partners, some of whom would live with them in their house. In a diary entry dated August 21, 1973, Bono wrote, "My public wife is still Cher in order to maintain all the things I want right now. That's the way it has to be." By 1974, the strain of maintaining a public illusion of marital bliss had become unbearable, and Bono finally separated from Cher. In turn, Cher demanded a divorce, citing involuntary servitude as the reason for the marriage's dissolution. Their divorce became final in 1975, and Cher, who had always been content to allow Bono to handle the business end of their careers, walked away virtually penniless, and owing her ex-husband millions of dollars. Following her divorce from Bono, Cher attempted to revive both her TV and music careers. Her solo follow-up to the Sonny and Cher comedy hour titled Cher was a hit, proving wrong Bono himself, who had once told Cher, "America will hate you and you won't have a job." Meanwhile, Bono's competing show, the Sonny Comedy Review, tanked after just one season. Although Cher continued to captivate TV audiences, her fortunes as a recording artist were dismal. Her 1975 album Star stalled at 153 on the Billboard 200. Her next album, 1976's I'd Rather Believe in You, fared even worse and failed to chart at all. Cher's next post-Sonny effort, 1977's Cherished, also failed to chart. Her subsequent album, To the Hard Way, which was a collaboration with her new husband Greg Allman, was also a misfire. The couple's clashing styles failed to excite public interest among fans of either artist. In 1978, Warner Brothers terminated Cher's contract. In the midst of her acrimonious divorce from Sonny Bono, Cher entered into a whirlwind romance with hard-partying Southern rocker Greg Allman, the vocalist for the Allman Brothers Band. Cher and Allman wed just 3 days after Cher's 1975 divorce from Bono. Only 9 days later, Cher filed to dissolve the marriage. Having been sheltered from the notorious wild side of the music business by Bono, the singer was ill-prepared to deal with Allman's alcoholism and heroin abuse. In J. Randy Taura-Borelli's biography, Cher, the singer explains that Allman was too impaired to even understand that Cher was dumping him. She said, "He was so high he didn't even understand me." Allman, pledging to get clean and sober, reconciled with Cher a month later. However, Cher's decision to reunite with Sonny Bono for a reboot of their successful variety show in 1976 put further strain on the couple's tumultuous relationship, leading to Allman himself filing for divorce.
People love to bring up that you were married to Cher. Are you tired of hearing about that?
Actually, she was married to me.
Allman relented when he learned that Cher was pregnant with their son Elijah Blue, and the two remained married until calling it quits for the last time in 1978. In 2017, Allman lost his long battle with liver cancer, passing away at 69. Cher reacted via Twitter stating, "Words are impossible." With her recording career in a tailspin, Cher chose to focus on her acting. In 1983, she was cast in a supporting role opposite Meryl Streep and Kurt Russell in Silkwood. The film, based on the real-life story of atomic energy whistleblower Karen Silkwood, earned respectable box office returns and critical praise for Cher, who won a Golden Globe and earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. Cher followed her Silkwood success with critically acclaimed dramatic roles in the films Mask and Suspect. But her greatest cinematic success would come with the 1987 romantic comedy Moonstruck, for which Cher nabbed the Oscar for Best Actress. By the decade's close, Cher had successfully returned to music with the 1989 hit If I Could Turn Back Time. Yet, just as Cher was enjoying the greatest success of her career, fate would deal her another blow, one that would temporarily sideline her from both film and music. While filming 1987's The Witches of Eastwick, she discovered she had contracted Epstein-Barr virus, although she wouldn't feel the full brunt of the disease until sometime later. As she told the New York Times, "For 2 years I couldn't work. It was terrible. I ended the second year with pneumonia. All these movie offers were coming in, but I had to turn them all down. I was really upset about it. And when I came back, I had to work my way back up from the beginning." By the 1980s, without Cher by his side, Sonny Bono's career as an entertainer was over. In 1988, Bono turned his attention to politics and a successful bid for mayor of Palm Springs, California. Reinventing himself as a conservative politician, Bono ran for Senate in 1992. Although he lost, Bono was undeterred in his ambition to hold national office. In 1994, he was elected to Congress as a representative of California's 44th District. But Bono's new role as a star of the Republican Party would be cut tragically short. While on vacation in Aspen in January 1998, Bono died in a skiing accident. Cher immediately flew from London to Los Angeles when she learned of Bono's death. In a tearful eulogy to her ex-husband, Cher praised Bono for his intelligence and foresight. She said, "He was smart enough to take an introverted 16-year-old girl and a guy with a bad voice and turn them into the most successful, beloved couple of our generation. He allowed himself to be the butt of our jokes, but people don't realize he created Sonny and Cher. He knew what was right for us." Cher's busy career left little time for her to be a conventional mother to her children. In a revealing 2014 interview with Entertainment Tonight, Cher's youngest child, Elijah Blue Allman, opened up about his troubled childhood. He explained, "When you go to boarding school at 7 years old, it's kind of hard to feel like you're not being shunned. Although he's come to terms with his childhood, he still holds some resentment toward his mother." Allman says, "I'm at an age where I'm making peace with it because you just have to, but it doesn't mean it's right. It's still wrong to do that." Allman and his wife, Marie Angela King, briefly moved in with Cher in 2013, but an undisclosed dispute led to mother and son cutting contact with one another. Allman described his relationship with his mother as a work in progress. Allman says, "We have our issues. We've worked through a lot of them. We've got some more to go, but when you're an adult, you take on a different sort of tone than when you're an adolescent. But there's unresolved stuff for sure." Despite their differences, however, Allman says he still admires his mother. He says, "You know, she's really talented. She's gorgeous. I mean, she's Cher. What's not to love?" Cher's marriage to Sonny Bono produced one child, son Chaz Salvador Bono. Born Chastity's son Bono, he underwent a 2-year female-to-male transition beginning in 2008. Bono, then identifying as a woman, was outed as a lesbian by a tabloid in 1990. Despite Cher's reputation as a gay icon, Bono said that his famous mother initially struggled to accept his sexuality and gender identity, before eventually becoming an ardent advocate for LGBTQ rights.
"I wanted her to be straight, get married, have a child, get divorced, and live a normal life, like everybody does."
Cher opened up on her acceptance of Bono's transition in a 2018 interview with Pride Source. The singer explained, "I didn't go through it that easily. There's such a fear of losing the child you love and what will replace that child. I felt, who will this new person be? Because I know who the person is now, but who will the new person be? And how will it work? And will I have lost somebody?" Still, she knew her son's happiness must come first. Cher explained, "It doesn't make any difference what anyone else feels or what anyone else thinks. Chaz is so happy now and we get along better than ever."
For many people, Jani Lane was the ultimate hair metal frontman. In an era full of pretty, leather-clad lead singers, he stood out, only to slowly decline as hair metal faded in popularity. This is the tragic real-life story of Warrant's Jani Lane. Jani Lane's controversies started from the moment he was born in Akron, Ohio in 1964, when his parents named him John Kennedy Oswald. According to his 2011 self-penned autobiography page, his parents were huge John F. Kennedy fans and didn't realize the significance of having the same last name as Kennedy's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. They soon realized their mistake and changed their son's name to John Patrick Oswald. He started playing drums at age 6 and claims to have started playing in clubs by age 11 using the stage name Mitch Dynamite. At 12, he got a guitar and started writing songs, which he would do for the rest of his life. Per a 2011 interview with Scab Pickers magazine, he and some friends moved to Florida after high school and played in a cover band called Dorian Gray. In 1985, they made their way to Hollywood and started a glam punk band, Plain Jane, with Jani as lead singer. Because he spelled Johnny as Jani, people assumed the man from Plain Jane was Jani Lane, and he stuck with it as a stage name. Plain Jane opened for bands like Guns N' Roses, but wasn't well received. Glam punk was out, glam metal was in, and bands like Poison and Warrant were getting all of the attention. Just as he was planning on moving back to Florida, he and drummer Steve Sweet were invited to join Warrant. According to his 2011 Scab Pickers interview, Jani Lane joined Warrant as a, quote, total sellout. He went on to tell the interviewer this: "Plain Jane was not getting paid. We're not getting laid. We got to do something else." Warrant was already a popular Sunset Strip draw, but when it came to getting a record deal, the band had little success. And since bands like Poison were walking the MTV Video Music Awards red carpet in tuxedos, Warrant wanted to follow suit. In one of the more bizarre musical relationships of the 1980s, a manager introduced Warrant to Prince, who gave them $7,000 to record a demo for possible distribution via Prince's label, Paisley Park. According to Lane, Prince's response was uninterested in the songs, but gave the band his blessing to try and use the demos elsewhere. One of the demos, the song Game of War, ended up on the 1989 soundtrack album to the movie Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. But Warrant remained unsigned, and Lane considered moving back to Florida. Months later, manager Tom Hullett, then known for his work with classic rock bands like the Moody Blues and Three Dog Night, went looking for a hair metal band to sign at the recommendation of Doc McGee, famous for making stars out of Bon Jovi and Motley Crue. Hullett took McGee's advice and signed Warrant to CBS Columbia Records. Warrant released their first album, Dirty Rotten Filthy Stinking Rich, in January 1989. It was a hit, eventually peaking at number 10 on the Billboard Top 200 chart. It also went multi-platinum, selling 2 million copies, while the live long-form video featuring concert performances of the album's songs sold an additional 100,000 copies. It makes sense that they were so successful in both audio and video formats because their sound and look was very much indicative of late 80s hair metal, which was extremely popular at the time. Warrant further encapsulated the spirit of hair metal by releasing not one, but 2 sentimental power ballads, Sometimes She Cries and Heaven. The latter, a fan favorite left over from Plain Jane and their highest ever charting hit, reaching number 2 on the Billboard charts. Of course, Warrant followed up Dirty Rotten Filthy Stinking Rich with an album whose title track was notoriously over the top and explicit. Cherry Pie was released on September 11, 1990, and was another hit, also peaking at number 10 on Billboard's Top 200, charting as the 21st biggest album of 1991, and going multi-platinum. Cherry Pie soon became Warrant's signature song. The lyrics include a series of entendres that can scarcely be called double, while the video featured the misadventures of a grinning blonde woman who is periodically hosed down by the entire band via a comically oversized fire hose. In 2011, Jani Lane explained that the song was actually a last-minute addition to the album. The president of Columbia Records reportedly called him and said, "Jani, you know I'm a big Aerosmith fan. Can you give me one more track, something kitschy and sexy like Love in an Elevator?" In fact, Jani once went on record in an interview with VH1 claiming to, quote, hate Cherry Pie, although he eventually recanted and professed love for the song on his 2011 autobiography page.
The album's called Cherry Pie. The record's called Cherry Pie. I'm doing cherry pie eating contests. The single's Cherry Pie, right?
Jani Lane's problems with women are another important factor when considering his wild early 90s Warrant years. During the making of Dirty Rotten Filthy Stinking Rich, Jani walked in on his then girlfriend in bed with his best friend. According to AllMusic, the event was so traumatizing that he had a, quote, nervous breakdown and spent time recovering in a psychiatric hospital, which subsequently delayed the album's completion. Jani later used the experience to write the song I Saw Red, which went on to be another hit single from the Cherry Pie album, peaking at number 10 on the Billboard Top 200 in February 1991. Jani regularly discussed the autobiographical nature of the song. In a 2011 interview, he had this to say about the song. I Saw Red is a true story, and I still hate my ex-girlfriend. I'm sure she's doing wonderful now. Unsubstantiated rumors on fan and gossip boards claim that the girlfriend in question was allegedly singer Becca Bramlett, and the man with whom she was cheating was Bon Jovi's Richie Sambora. However, Jani and Becca remained friends throughout Jani's life. In a 2010 interview with Metal Sludge, Lane stated that he and Becca were still very good friends, which casts some doubt on these rumors. Even more notorious was Jani Lane's whirlwind courtship, marriage, and divorce of his first wife, Bobby Brown, who came into his life when she played the blonde bombshell in the infamous Cherry Pie video. In 2011, Bobby told Legendary Rock Interviews that Jani started pursuing her after they made the video together, ignoring the fact that she was already dating Matthew Nelson of the band Nelson.
He was interesting to me, but I had a boyfriend, so I wasn't a cheater. But, when we broke up, he asked me out and I said yes.
In 2013, Bobby described to the New York Post how Jani flew her to Louisiana for a concert for their first date, finally making the match made in hairband heaven come true. 4 months later, the couple was expecting a baby. They decided to marry in July 1991 and welcomed their daughter, Taylor, in early 1992. Unfortunately, the problems started soon after. Bobby told the New York Post, "I loved Jani, but he drank a lot and he could be mean when he was drinking. When I found out he was cheating on me, I couldn't forgive that, and I left him." In August 1992, Warrant released their third album, Dog Eat Dog. The album was relatively successful, going gold by October by selling 500,000 copies. but it was nowhere near the triumphs of their first 2 records. The only charting single on Dog Eat Dog was a cover of Queen's We Will Rock You, which peaked at number 83 on Billboard's Top 200. Much has been made about how grunge music killed off hair metal. Louder called out Alice in Chains' 1990 album Facelift as the first grunge album to hit big. And Jani Lane had his own Alice in Chains story that neatly summed up hair metal's dramatic eclipse. Encyclopedia.com quotes an interview with Lane from Musician magazine in which he recalls a marketing meeting with the president of Columbia Records for Cherry Pie. In the interview, Lane had this recollection. The first time I walked into the president of Columbia Records' office, and I remember seeing this gigantic poster of our album cover on the wall above the secretary's desk. I thought, wow, I guess we're going to get a push on this one. When he returned a year later to discuss promoting Dog Eat Dog, however, priorities had changed. This time, as Lane walked into Don Einer's office, who was then the president of Columbia Records, Lane recalled seeing a huge poster of Alice in Chains' Dirt over his secretary's desk. Upon seeing the poster in Einer's office, Lane knew that Warrant's days were numbered, as the grunge era was about to sweep the nation. In 1993, Jani left Warrant for the first of many times to pursue a solo career, but he was back by the end of the year. Jani Lane and Warrant were still working from the mid-1990s to the early 2000s, but things were, quote, tough. According to his 2011 autobiographical page, dropped by Columbia, Warrant made 4 albums for independent label CMC between 1995 and 2001, none of which sold well or charted at all. In 1993, Jani started working on his Jabberwocky project, to which he periodically returned throughout the rest of his life. Jani married his second wife, actress Roanne Brewer, in 1995. They had a daughter, Madison, and were married until 2005. Although on his autobiographical page, Jani mentions the divorce in the same sentence in which he reports that he left Warrant in 2002 due to business differences. In 2003, he released a power pop solo album, Back Down to One, which was a huge commercial failure. Lane then entered rehab for alcohol abuse. 2004 was another hard year, and Jani spent much of it in the spotlight, working out his personal problems in front of an often unsympathetic audience. During that period, Lane appeared on VH1's Celebrity Fit Club, where he looked bloated and unhealthy from drinking. He also made a brief appearance on the Bad Boys of Metal tour, which he quit after just a few shows. As recounted in a piece by Spin, Lane quit the tour because he felt some audience members were only there to laugh at him. He even faced legal action from his former band when he attempted to start his own version of Warrant. Jani Lane's alcohol addiction continued to hurt him right up to the end of his life. He rejoined Warrant in 2008, but his lack of sobriety caused problems, and he was back out again in 6 months. 2009 brought an arrest for driving under the influence that led to a sentence of 3 years probation, and according to Spin, he was sentenced to 120 days in jail for another DUI in 2010. Nevertheless, there were some good moments during this time. Also in 2010, he joined fellow former hair metal superstars Great White on tour. In an interview with Louder, Great White's guitarist Mark Kendall had this to say about Lane. Jani was a complete professional. He was never late, and the fans were saying he hadn't looked or sounded so good in 20 years. He also announced on his autobiography page in 2011 that he had married his third wife, Kimberly Nash. The good times, however, didn't last. On August 11th, 2011, Jani Lane was found dead of acute alcohol poisoning in a Woodland Hills, California Comfort Inn at just 47 years old. He had no identification, save for a note in his pocket that read, "I am Jani Lane." His sister Vicky told Radar Online, "Alcoholism is not something he chose. It's something he fought every day and it just won." If you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, please call the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration's 24/7 national helpline at 1-800-662-HELP.
The Runaways have rightly earned their spot in rock and roll history. As one of the first all-female rock bands, they proved to the world that women could rock as hard as men could. While they may have made music history, it came at a personal cost. Here is their story. It's hard to believe when listening to their music, but all of the Runaways were only 15 or 16 when they started the band in the mid-70s. They were one of the first all-female rock bands, and a highly provocative one at that time. The group may have sounded very adult and sang some fairly racy lyrics about lust, drugs, and drinking, but they were still young kids. The 70s was also a time when anything went in rock and roll, and not necessarily for the best. According to NPR, this time in musical history was when young performers could be far more easily exploited and exposed to much older men's predations. Even the Runaways' lead singer, Cher Curry, admitted in an interview with Spin that their unsupervised rock and roll lifestyle and mostly absent and permissive parents would not have gone over well in today's world. Curry told the outlet, "I don't think the Runaways could have happened under those circumstances. And our band was a milestone. Thank God we had the parents that we had, because I can tell you, being the mother of a 19-year-old, there isn't a chance I would have let that happen." Kim Fowley was a renowned music producer and promoter in the 1970s, specializing in the glam rock scene. He is credited with recruiting the members of the Runaways and becoming their manager, while helping the group rise to fame. But Fowley had a cruel streak. According to the Huffington Post, Fowley was notorious for preying on young, vulnerable girls, hence his interest in an all-girl rock band.
Cher Curry. Is that your real name? Well, Cher Curry, do you sing or play a musical instrument?
He deliberately marketed the Runaways as hard rock jailbait, encouraging them and teaching them to look and act as sexy as possible on stage, despite the girls being as young as 15. In an attempt to prepare the band for facing rough crowds, Fowley also thought it would be a great idea to throw blunt objects at the girls while they were rehearsing. He would frequently scream at them, verbally abuse them, and force them to work grueling hours. Even more insultingly, the Runaways discovered that their management was ripping them off. As Curry explained in later interviews, the band would often perform concerts to sold-out crowds and only get paid $20. Eventually, the Runaways fired Kim Fowley as their manager. All the members of the Runaways dove headfirst into the heady rock and roll lifestyle. The late nights, the parties, the fans, and of course, the drugs. In an interview with The Guardian, Cher Curry shared that the band had extremely easy access to drugs. People would just give them to the girls. As Curry noted in her interview, "Our management, our booking agent, they were all feeding us drugs. The thing was, back in the 70s, if you didn't do drugs, there was something wrong with you." Curry said it started with Quaaludes, and she later graduated to cocaine. By the time she was 17, Curry was completely burned out on drugs. She admitted that she continued to struggle with drug addiction long after she left the band. Curry was ultimately able to get her life together and took a job as a tech in the drug and psych wards at Coldwater Canyon Hospital. Eventually, she became a drug and alcohol counselor.
I became a drug counselor for drug-addicted teens right after that.
Eventually, the Runaways started experiencing turnover. In 1977, both Cher Curry and Jackie Fox left the band. After 2 years, Curry was burned out from drugs and flat out exhausted from the fast-paced rock and roll life. Fox was likewise weary from the rock star lifestyle. Both Curry and Fox had also hit their limit in dealing with Fowley's regular abuse. They were done. But the remaining Runaways weren't ready to be done with the band. Without Curry or Fox, the band had two choices: break up or find replacements. They opted for the latter. Vicky Blue took over as their bassist. Curry, the band's former primary vocalist, proved much harder to replace. After all, it was her face that fans looked for. In the end, guitarist Joan Jett took over as the lead vocalist for the band. In an interview with New Musical Express, Jett admitted that she knew that she wasn't the frontwoman Curry was, but at the time, she wasn't ready to let the band go. Jett recalled in the interview, "I knew I wasn't Cherie. I knew I wasn't a blonde bombshell. I knew I wasn't the one people wanted to look at. And that's a weird feeling. I'm getting emotional. I don't know why. What else could I do? Either end it or plow ahead and not worry." Not long after leaving the Runaways, Cherie Currie was the victim of a horrific kidnapping and assault when she was only 17. According to The Guardian, the man responsible was a stalker, as well as an obsessed fan who had previously killed 6 other women in Texas. Apparently, the kidnapper was driving a limousine and urged the young Currie to go for a ride. An admitted people-pleaser, Currie agreed to join him, probably not thinking about what might happen given all the risky behavior she had previously engaged in while touring with the Runaways. However, the man ended up driving her to an abandoned house where he imprisoned and assaulted her. Luckily, Currie was able to escape her kidnapper when she managed to get a hold of a knife and stabbed him.
And so I saw that knife and I just had to get to that knife.
In an interview with Democrat and Chronicle, Currie acknowledged just how lucky she was to be alive after her ordeal, telling the outlet, "It was a terrible thing that had happened, but I survived. I was blessed. I survived when I shouldn't have. This man had told me he had killed 6 women." Although Cherie Currie quit the Runaways in 1977, she was still under contract to Kim Fowley and was obligated to work with him for one more album. She ended up making her first solo album, Beauty's Only Skin Deep. In an interview with OC Weekly, Currie said that the album was slapped together within 2 weeks and referred to her solo debut as, quote, "the worst album that was recorded in history." Mercury Records didn't even release the album in the United States, only in France and Japan. But after that, Currie was no longer forced to work with Fowley. Later in 1980, Cherie and her twin sister, Marie, made a record together, Messin' with the Boys, which Currie had also referred to as, quote, "a mistake." In an interview, Currie recalled what it was like working with their sister on the album. "My sister thought she wanted to be in the music business, but when she was in it, she didn't want it anymore. When she walked away from the record deal, and then they dropped me, she went off in her married life and had kids." For Cherie, however, walking away like her sister did was simply not an option. In the same interview, Currie revealed her depressed state of mind in the aftermath of making Messin' with the Boys. "I could hardly live with what I had done, and I let the drugs take over. I was very upset that I let myself do that record. At the time, I thought it had ruined my career, and my drug addiction got worse and worse." The Runaways' lead guitarist, Lita Ford, wasn't without her own personal problems either. At one point, she was married to Nitro lead vocalist Jim Gillette. The couple married in 1994 after knowing each other for only 2 weeks. Ford and Gillette later had a highly contentious divorce in 2011, with Gillette getting full custody of their 2 sons. Although Gillette publicly stated that Ford was allowed supervised visitation, Ford apparently didn't see her sons again for almost a decade. When asked in interviews about the custody arrangement and the subsequent absence from her children's lives, Ford responded, "By the time our divorce was final and everything was said and done, it was such a joke that it didn't matter what I got on paper. There was no way I was going to be in those boys' lives. They were such a mess by the time I left, and my ex-husband left, that it just didn't matter." The boys were around 17 and 21 when Ford finally saw them again in person. Evidently, the meeting did not go particularly well, and Ford's sons continue to avoid seeing her. Ford claims her ex-husband turned her sons against her and responded in 2015 by creating a parental alienation awareness Facebook page. Sadly, the Runaways drummer, Sandy West, died at the early age of 47 in 2006. She had been suffering from lung cancer. According to The Hollywood Reporter, West passed away in hospice care in San Dimas, California. A California girl at heart, West grew up in Huntington Beach and split time between her main hobbies, skiing and surfing. It wasn't until her grandfather gifted the young West with her first drum set that she discovered her raw gift as a formidable musician. In her post-Runaways life, West never achieved the same level of fame that her former bandmates had, but she never lost her passion for drumming. Even as she went on to work in construction, West continued to play in her own band, the Sandy West Band, and would occasionally perform with former Runaways bandmate Cherie Currie. In an official statement, Joan Jett came out and expressed her sadness over her old friend's passing, writing, "We shared the dream of girls playing rock and roll. Sandy was an exuberant and powerful drummer. I am overcome from the loss of my friend. I always told her we changed the world." Cherie Currie also put out a statement shortly after West's death. Currie's statement had this heartwarming remembrance of her former bandmate. Sandy West loved her fans, her friends, and family almost to a fault. It will never be the same for me again to step on a stage because Sandy West was the best, and I will miss her forever. As for Kim Fowley, the Runaways' disturbed, abusive manager, he continued to live on and died of bladder cancer at the age of 75. Most peculiarly, it was none other than Cherie Currie who helped care for Fowley in his final days. It comes as a shock to any outsider, particularly when the Runaways themselves have openly talked about how horribly Fowley abused them. Currie even once compared their relationship with Fowley to, quote, battered wife syndrome. However, Currie admitted in an interview with Spin that Fowley did eventually apologize for his treatment of her and her fellow Runaways. Kim Fowley apologized to me on the phone a year ago, in 2009, saying if he had to do it over again, he wouldn't have treated us that way. He didn't know how to handle 15-year-old girls. In his own crazy way, he loved us. An apology doesn't seem as though it should make up for years of abuse, but for Currie, it was enough. In a 2016 interview with The Guardian, shortly after her former manager's death, Currie explained that it felt better to forgive Fowley than hold on to her anger. They even collaborated one more time for Currie's 2015 solo album, Reverie. While remembering Fowley in her interview with The Guardian, Currie had this to say, "People can change. They can. Without Kim, Joan never would have happened. Lita and myself. So I owe him a great deal, and I was very honored to take care of him towards the end of his life. I would have done it again and again, and I'm sorry that I lost him."
George Michael carried an air of mystery about him, which matched his soulfulness and seriousness about his art. That all hinted at a man who dealt with profound sadness, misery, and heartbreak. Here's the tragic real-life story of George Michael. The early years of George Michael don't seem to have been outwardly traumatic, but they were reportedly marked with a damaging coldness and distance from his family. The future star was raised in a small London apartment by two parents, but his father, an immigrant who ran a restaurant, was rarely around, which created a disconnect between father and son. According to People magazine, Michael said, "I was never praised, never held, so it wasn't exactly the little house on the prairie." While he was interested in music from an early age, he didn't realize he wanted to pursue music as his life's work until after he got seriously hurt. In his memoir, Bear, he wrote, "At the age of about 8, I had a head injury, and I know it sounds bizarre and unlikely, but it was quite a bad bang, and I had it stitched up and stuff. Suddenly, all I wanted to know about was music." He didn't let his father know about his ambitions right away. He told Event magazine, "Funnily enough, my father always used to say that he didn't think I could sing." According to a Daily Mail interview with Michael's former Wham manager, the singer's decades-long battle with intoxicating substances began relatively late in adulthood, after he'd started his solo career. That drug use ultimately turned varied and voluminous. In September 2008, police in North London discovered Michael in a public restroom using crack cocaine and marijuana. The amounts on his person were small, and he was released without further legal action. According to Kenny Goss, Michael's former romantic partner of 13 years, taking drugs was a matter of course. Goss told The Sun, "I would find drugs and flush everything down the toilet. He was absent-minded, so he would just think he'd lost them."
He knew how I felt about it, and I would say that was probably the only area that he wasn't really honest with me about.
Michael himself told The Guardian in 2009 that at the peak of his drug usage, he smoked in the neighborhood of 24 joints each day. By the time of the interview, he was down to 7 or 8 a day. After losing one of his romantic partners to AIDS back in 1993, Michael was understandably left devastated and in deep mourning for a prolonged period of time. That only got worse when in 1996, his mother received news that she had a rapidly destructive terminal case of cancer. She was able to spend one last Christmas with Michael and the rest of her family, eventually passing away just 2 months later in February 1997. In the documentary George Michael Freedom, Michael admitted that he was spiritually crushed after her passing. The singer subsequently fell into a deep, dark sadness. He admitted, "I'd never felt that kind of depression. It was something different to grief. It was on top of grief. I was grieving for my mother still, but it was something else. It was the darkest time."
I just kind of kept banging my head against a brick wall for the best part of 3 years and becoming more and more depressed. It was like a vicious cycle.
In the documentary, Michael also revealed that the mental darkness left him feeling like his life had been a waste of time, and that even 2 decades on, he'd never quite moved on from his mother's death. While Michael publicly exhibited the effects of a lifelong struggle with substance abuse, his drug issues may have troubled him far more than his fans were aware, and especially in the last few years of his life. A friend of Michael's told The Sun, "I believe easy access to drugs was the cause of his problems. Once this disease gets hold of you, it's hard to fight it." A source close to Michael told The Telegraph that the singer's drug problem almost took his life more than once. The individual added, "He's been rushed to the ER on several occasions. He used heroin. I think it's amazing he's lasted as long as he has." Michael scored his last major UK hit in 2012, and he'd largely retreated from public life, except for the occasional live performance. But at Christmas, the veteran superstar is on millions of people's minds, thanks to his contributions to the holiday music canon. He was a soloist on Band-Aid's Do They Know It's Christmas and recorded Last Christmas with Wham! It's especially sad, then, that Michael passed away on Christmas Day 2016, while his songs were undoubtedly making people happy in other parts of the world. Michael's partner, Fadi Fawaz, went over to the singer's house in the morning as the two planned to have Christmas lunch together. According to The Telegraph, that's when he discovered Michael, quote, lying peacefully in bed. Authorities called to the scene were initially puzzled by the death, but were not suspicious of foul play. A few months later, a coroner revealed that Michael passed away at the age of 53 from natural causes, specifically issues related to the heart and liver. Fawaz doesn't believe that Michael passed from natural causes. He thinks he took his own life, based on his knowledge of Michael's behavior and the date on which his death occurred. Fawaz told The Telegraph, "George died on his mother's birthday, so that might answer a few questions. Not to mention it took 5 attempts to manage to end his life. That would mean that if Michael did pass away from heart and liver problems in 2016, he had sadly attempted to take his own life on 4 previous occasions." If you or anyone you know is having suicidal thoughts, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK, 1-800-273-8255. Legendary Southern rockers Lynyrd Skynyrd have traveled a road that's been anything but smooth. They've weathered more tragedy than many groups, and through it all, they've made some truly epic music. Their albums are classics of the genre, including songs like Sweet Home Alabama, Free Bird, and many more. Here's the tragic, real-life story of Lynyrd Skynyrd. Fans of Lynyrd Skynyrd know that drummer Artemis Pyle survived the horrific plane crash that claimed the lives of other group members, but might not realize aviation was a passion he shared with his father, a retired Marine awarded a Purple Heart for injuries sustained while fighting in the South Pacific during World War II. Artemis Pyle followed in his father's footsteps. He enlisted in the Marines and hoped to pursue a career in civil aviation after the service. He even took flying lessons in the Marines, and his father, then a civilian, did as well. But tragedy followed when Del Pyle was killed in a mid-air plane crash over Albuquerque in 1971. In an interview with radio personality Eddie Winters, Artemis recalled how his father had been hit from above and behind by a B-57 weather reconnaissance bomber. Dad was in his Cessna 150 flying over some property that he was going to build houses on. He liked to do that. He liked to look at pieces of property from the air. He was killed instantly. That kept me from really losing my mind because Dad never suffered. He was doing what he loved and then he was gone. A lengthy feature story in Spin magazine back in April 1999 detailed the tough road Lynyrd Skynyrd took to achieving their dreams as a band, as well as the rough ways bandmates treated one another all along the way, often resorting to violence to address their issues. The violent tendencies started before anyone knew who the band was, and it didn't stop when the fame came. There were stories of fighting in public and in private, of going on stage with bruises, bandages, and missing teeth. Introducing seemingly endless tours and a stable supply of drugs and alcohol into the proceedings didn't help. Take the story of a bar fight in Munich. It sprawled across the city and followed the band back to the hotel, where singer Ronnie Van Zant broke a bottle over the head of a Skynyrd roadie and used the shards to slice up guitarist Gary Rossington's hands. The show went on, though. Rossington played the next night with bandaged hands, as did Van Zant, who broke some bones punching someone somewhere along the way. And that's just one incident in the history of the strange and volatile rock and roll family. One of Ronnie Van Zant's last great songs, That Smell, was in direct reference to Labor Day weekend in 1976. That's when Gary Rossington drove drunk and wrapped his new vehicle around a tree, injuring himself badly in the process. Van Zant told the Los Angeles Times, he passed out at the wheel of his brand new Ford Torino. He knocked down a telephone pole, split an oak tree, and did $7,000 worth of damage to a house. That's being just plain stupid. I told him that on his hospital bed. He also told him so in That Smell, which he wrote with guitarist Allen Collins. Some speculate, though, that Van Zant was speaking as much to himself as he was to Rossington and his other bandmates when he wrote the song. Skynyrd biographer Mark Rabowski wrote that at the time, the singer was an avid indulger in cocaine and quaaludes, but he was also at a point in his life where he was starting to rethink that lifestyle. Van Zant told the Los Angeles Times, "For the first time, I'm really thinking about the future. I'm 27 now and I've got a baby girl and I plan to stick around and watch her grow up." On October 20th, 1977, as they prepared to embark on a flight to Baton Rouge, several members of Lynyrd Skynyrd and their entourage were nervous about flying in the band's leased Convair 240 and had expressed reservations to Ronnie Van Zant. His reported response was eerie. "Hey, if the Lord wants you to die on this plane, when it's your time, it's your time. Let's go, man. We got a gig to do." According to reports, almost 2 hours into the flight, both of the plane's engines died, and it began a 10-minute free fall into a dense forest of pine trees close to the Mississippi-Louisiana border. When it was all over, the cockpit and tail had separated from the cabin, and the plane had cut a 500-foot path through the woods. 7 people were dead, including Ronnie Van Zant, guitarist Steve Gaines, and his sister Cassie, a background singer for the group. Suddenly, the cover of what would be the original band's final studio album, Street Survivors, seemed full of terrible foreshadowing. The album had been out 3 days, and the cover featured the band members standing in between burning buildings. Steve Gaines, in particular, seemed to be engulfed in flames, his eyes closed. The record was pulled from the shelves until Skynyrd's record company could manufacture an alternate cover. And while it all seemed prescient, no one could have actually predicted the crash would happen, and that it would silence the leading voice of Southern rock. Of all the survivors of the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash, Allen Collins seemed to be the most unlucky and the most self-destructive. Doctors had wanted to amputate his arm after the crash, but his father, acting on Collins' behalf, refused to give them permission. According to the band's biographer, even after recovering, both Collins and Rossington suffered from terrible nightmares and survivor's guilt, and both self-medicated with copious consumption of cocaine, booze, and quaaludes. They also eventually made music again, forming the Rossington-Collins band with several other Skynyrd bandmates, making a record and hitting the road on yet another rock and roll tour. Days into the band's first tour, Collins' wife, Kathy, suffered a hemorrhage during a miscarriage and died, devastating the already vulnerable guitarist. His drinking and drug use accelerated, and a rift developed between him and Rossington. The Rossington-Collins band lasted only 2 years, after which Collins' indulgences wound up having dire consequences. He had a number of alcohol and barbiturate-fueled car crashes, one of which, in 1986, took the life of his girlfriend and left him paralyzed from the chest down. When surviving members of Lynyrd Skynyrd went out on a tribute tour in 1987, Collins was unable to perform, relegated to being wheeled out on stage several times per show to give speeches on why he couldn't play and on the dangers of drugs and alcohol. He died in 1990 of complications from pneumonia at 37 years old. Bassist Leon Wilkeson was among the most severely injured in the Skynyrd plane crash, and his heart stopped twice on the operating table. The left arm injury was of particular concern. It was his fretting arm when he played bass, and his wounds had gotten infected, nearly leading to the arm's amputation. Even after he recovered, he had severe nerve damage and minimal range of motion in that arm, causing him to hold his bass guitar almost upright for the remainder of his performing days. Other issues affected his health in the years after the crash. On a tour in the early 90s, Wilkeson awakened in the tour bus in a pool of his own blood, his throat having been cut by someone on the bus. He survived, but the perpetrator was never identified. In 2001, he was cited for driving under the influence in Florida, a charge he was preparing to face in July of that year. He never did, though, as he was found dead in a hotel room. According to the autopsy, Wilkeson was suffering from liver and lung diseases at the time of his death, with drug intoxication as a contributing factor. Huey Thomason was Southern rock royalty even before he joined Lynyrd Skynyrd in 1996. As one of the founders, chief songwriters, and singers of the Outlaws, he was responsible for a number of the genre's classic songs, including their version of the cowboy anthem Ghost Riders in the Sky. Fittingly, legend has it that the Outlaws were signed in 1974 by Arista Records president Clive Davis after he saw the band open for Lynyrd Skynyrd, and at the suggestion of Ronnie Van Zant. Thomason claimed he joined Skynyrd on a 6-month contract and wound up staying 9 years. When he left in 2005, he did so on good terms, and for the right reasons. He told Classic Rock Revisited, "I just felt like I needed to do something different. I really didn't do any singing with Skynyrd. I wanted to get back to doing what I love to do." He reformed the Outlaws and hit the road, headlining small venues and opening for bigger bands. Tragically, he died of a heart attack in his sleep on September 9th, 2017. Billy Powell nearly lost his nose in the plane crash that ended Lynyrd Skynyrd for a decade, but of all the passengers on the plane, he was among the least grievously injured. He was the only member of Skynyrd to attend the funerals for his bandmates Ronnie Van Zant and Steve Gaines, as the rest of the survivors were still in the hospital. Powell played in the Rossington Collins Band after the crash and was one of the first Skynyrd members to sign up for the 1987 reunion and subsequent tours, but he was not always well. In the early morning hours of January 28, 2009, Powell called police in Orange Park, Florida, complaining of dizziness and difficulty breathing. By the time police and paramedics arrived at Powell's home, he was unconscious and unresponsive. He was pronounced dead after repeated attempts to revive him failed. According to one report, he had failed to show up for a cardiologist appointment shortly before his death. The next Lynyrd Skynyrd album, God and Guns, included Gifted Hands, a song dedicated to Powell. Gary Rossington cheated death when he survived the plane crash that killed Ronnie Van Zant and Steve and Cassie Gaines, and he continued to tell the Grim Reaper exactly where he could go. The issue was his heart, which has been through a lot, particularly in recent years. In 2003, Rossington had quintuple bypass surgery after doctors discovered during routine screening that he was suffering from coronary artery disease. In 2015, he suffered a heart attack. Then, in August 2017, Lynyrd Skynyrd announced that Rossington's scheduled procedures, once again to fix problems with his heart, led the band to cancel some dates on that year's tour. With their leader's health a concern, Lynyrd Skynyrd announced a farewell tour in 2018, even as Rossington shared something incredible with the Tampa Bay Times. "I've had heart attacks on stage a lot. I don't want to just say, well, we're never going to end, because I don't want to die and then end it that way, which is a heavy thing to talk about, but I have to." It wasn't long before the farewell tour took on yet another meaning, when guitarist Ed King passed away in 2018. King, who had been with the group since 1972, started out as a temporary replacement and just ended up staying. Rolling Stone reported that while the cause of death wasn't immediately specified, his passing came after a battle with lung cancer. In spite of tragedy after tragedy, the music of Lynyrd Skynyrd lives on. It might not be played by the same group of good old Southern boys anymore, but it still holds the same deep meaning it did for fans decades ago. Perhaps the best kind of immortality there is.
The Allman Brothers Band entertained millions with their unique mix of blues, southern rock, and good old-fashioned rock star drama. Between numerous deaths, drugs galore, massive infighting, and celebrity marriages, the story of the Allman Brothers is so much more than their records. The Allman Brothers certainly weren't the only band to do drugs and live the rock star life to excess, but they took their drugs and money lifestyle to a level few bands can even dream of, and if you pitch their real-life issues to a Hollywood studio, they'd probably reject you for being cartoonishly unrealistic. As Greg Allman recounted in his memoir, My Cross to Bear, as the Allman Brothers got more successful, they increasingly devoted themselves full-time to drugs, rock and roll craziness, and more drugs. Cocaine in particular was huge among the group, and they spent almost literal truckloads of money on the white stuff. As Allman recounted, one time they played a 41-day tour that paid $80,000 per show. You don't need to be a mathematician to know that equals a whole lot of money, well over $3 million, and yet by the time the tour was through, the band had managed to hold on to a meager $100,000. That's what happens when you live a life so excessive that, as Allman himself said, quote, "Our roadies had roadies." And then there was the jet they bought, because of course they did. The story gets even better. Allegedly, when they arrived for their first flight, the crew had spelled out "Welcome Allman Brothers" on the bar using cocaine. When Rolling Stone asked him just how much he spent on his drug habit, he had this to say: "I spent quite a bit. Dealers that like musicians, they'll come and just lay anything on you. Just like the little rhyme goes, the first one's free and the second one's on me. And the third one, you pay for." Don't expect anyone in the Allman Brothers band to give a lecture on fiscal responsibility. Few bands have dealt with more death and tragedy than the Allman Brothers, starting on October 29, 1971, when Duane Allman, Greg's brother and the young group's heart and soul, lost his life at the age of 24. Even by rock and roll standards, Duane Allman died way too young. As reported by Rolling Stone, Allman was riding his motorcycle down a Georgia road when he attempted to swerve past a truck. He lost control of the motorcycle and was pinned beneath it, skidding at least 50 feet. Despite several hours of surgery, Allman died in the hospital. He left behind a grieving brother and bandmates, along with millions of saddened fans. There's no telling what he would have contributed to music had he survived, but considering how, despite his short life, he still gave us Midnight Rider, it's safe to say he had a ton of great music and life left in him. Of all the people affected by Duane Allman's all-too-early death, nobody was more devastated than the band's bassist, Barry Oakley. Then, on November 11, 1972, just slightly over a year after Allman's death, something heartbreakingly eerie happened. Oakley was riding his motorcycle in Macon, Georgia. Coincidentally or intentionally, he was only a few blocks away from where Allman had his fatal accident. Like Allman, Oakley lost control of his motorcycle and collided with another vehicle. Later that day, after initially refusing medical treatment, he passed away from a fractured skull and cerebral swelling. He, like Allman, was just 24 when he died. As drummer Butch Trucks recalled in his blog, "I don't think Barry really knew how to exist in a world without Duane. The sparkle that was Barry was simply gone." By all accounts, it seems the only thing Barry truly cared about since Duane's death was being with Duane again. Barry Oakley was buried next to him in Macon. As the Allman Brothers grew more successful, certain members became bona fide celebrities as well as musicians. Greg Allman took that status to its logical extreme, entering into a high-profile celebrity marriage that was doomed from the start and made nobody happy. In 1975, pop superstar Cher finalized her incredibly messy divorce from Sonny Bono. At the same time, she kicked off a fling with Allman, who wrote in his memoir, "She smelled like I would imagine a mermaid would smell. I've never smelled it since, and I'll never forget it." Just a few days after Cher's divorce was finalized, they headed off to Vegas to tie the knot. But just 9 days later, Cher filed papers to end the marriage. The reason? According to Cher, she was unable to deal with Greg Allman's abundant drug and alcohol use. They got back together a month later and even had a child together, but Cher and Allman simply weren't a good match for each other. Cher reuniting with Bono for a new TV show didn't help matters, and the two were separated in 1977 and divorced in 1979. Allman later admitted, "There was no future for us because she has that constant paranoia of my going back to alcohol." Plenty of rock acts deal with the occasional drug bust. It comes with the territory, after all. But in 1976, the Allman Brothers dealt with a bust so bad it stopped the band dead in its tracks for years and linked them to organized crime. It started with Scooter Herring, who was Greg Allman's personal road manager. Part of his job description was to hook the band up with their drugs, and unfortunately for them, Herring was said to have gotten his drugs as part of a drug ring run by a notorious mobster named J.C. Hawkins. Cocaine is always a bad idea, and getting it through the mob is an even worse one. The FBI didn't like it very much either, and Herring was targeted as a drug-running middleman. Allman initially tried to snuff the investigation by refusing to talk, but the feds told him he'd go to prison for perjury. They offered him immunity in exchange for his testimony, and Herring apparently persuaded Allman to take it. Allman wasn't keen on doing it, though, telling Rolling Stone, "It was terrible. I was up against the wall, I was in the corner, backed in the corner." The jury convicted Herring, and the judge gave him 75 years in prison, although his conviction was overturned on appeal in 1978. To some of the Allman Brothers band, the testimony was unforgivable and akin to snitching. The band splintered briefly, and as for Allman, he found himself under police protection after receiving death threats. It's a sad and often tragic fact of life. Everyone with an addiction issue eventually faces rock bottom.
Serious drinking. I would have to drink, I was drinking about a quart of vodka every day of my life.
For Greg Allman, that came in 1995, spread out over an agonizing, embarrassing 5 days. As Allman recounted in My Cross to Bear, the week the Allman Brothers were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was a terrible one for him. He later described the major impact it had on him, writing, "It should have been the greatest week of my life, but instead I hit an all-time low. I was out of it, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually." He celebrated the honor by getting stone-cold drunk for the entire week. The band made 2 late-night TV appearances, one for Conan O'Brien and the other for David Letterman. With the latter, he recalls looking especially bad, and it was a miracle he even made it through the set. He knew it too, later saying of the Letterman gig, quote, "I don't even recognize the guy singing Midnight Rider." He didn't even make it to the rehearsal for their Hall of Fame performance, and come the actual induction, Allman was there physically, but that was about it. Still drunk as ever, he completely blanked on his planned speech and spoke for just 14 seconds about his brother before wandering away. Allman was so embarrassed by his appearances that he vowed to get his life together and started rehab not long afterward.
I kicked heroin, cocaine, alcohol, cigarettes. That's about enough.
It takes a lot to get fired from a hard-partying band for partying too hard, but that appears to be at least one reason founding member Dickie Betts hasn't been in the Allman Brothers since 2000. To hear Betts tell it during a 2017 Rolling Stone interview, he was ousted from the band because he dared to demand an audit of the band's money from their manager, Bert Holman. But to hear band members like J. Mo Johansson tell it, they gave Betts an ultimatum because he had simply become impossible to deal with and continued drinking and partying as much as he ever had, in spite of his insistence that lifestyle was going to end. Johansson told Rolling Stone he would say, "I need to go get myself straight," and that's what he would do. This time, he didn't do it. He didn't get fired, he quit. That, coupled with what the band perceived as his unbearable, bossy, take-charge attitude, meant everything finally came to a head and ended when Betts says he retired. In the past decade, the Allman Brothers have been dealing more and more with death for various reasons. The years 2011 and 2013 saw the respective passings of drummer David "Frankie" Toller and his brother, guitarist Dan Toller, at the too young ages of 59 and 65. The Tollers weren't founding members, joining the band during their first reunion in 1980. The band broke up 2 years later, but the Tollers remained at Greg Allman's side, touring with his solo act, the Greg Allman Band. Sadly, by 2009, Frankie's health was giving out and he underwent surgery to receive a liver transplant. On June 4, 2011, he passed away from his illness while in hospice care. That same year, Dan was diagnosed with ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. He succumbed to his illness in February 2013. Even though they officially said farewell 3 years earlier, 2017 was truly the end for some tragic reasons. The first death that year was Claude "Butch" Trucks, a founding member, one of the band's 2 original drummers, and one of the few band members to stick around from beginning to end. In January of that year, according to the Miami Herald, the 69-year-old Trucks took his own life. His wife, Melinda, immediately dialed 911, telling the dispatcher she had just seen her husband shoot himself. Paramedics arrived, but Trucks died at the scene shortly after. Greg Allman reacted in a statement with, "I'm heartbroken. I've lost another brother and it hurts beyond words. He was a great man and a great drummer, and I'm going to miss him forever. Rest in peace, Brother Butch." It wasn't long before they met again. In 2017, more than 4 decades after Duane Allman's untimely death, the 69-year-old Greg joined him once again. Allman had lived a hard-partying life for decades, and starting in 2007, his lifestyle began to take its toll. That year, he contracted hepatitis C, something he blamed on a dirty tattoo needle. He ended up needing a liver transplant, and around the same time, he also started experiencing an irregular heartbeat that forced him to go both vegan and gluten-free. In 2016, he started postponing, then outright canceling shows, and cited various reasons for doing so.
I just, over a period of about 3 years, I realized that it was just a chore to get up and move.
Most likely, the unspecified health problems that were taking a toll on him was the liver cancer that would eventually take his life. In May of 2017, he succumbed to that cancer, dying in his Savannah, Georgia home. Even though his life was crazed, turbulent, and often tragic, Allman repeatedly insisted that he had no regrets. Like he said in My Cross to Bear, "When it's all said and done, I'll go to my grave and my brother will greet me saying, 'Nice work, little brother, you did all right.'" I must have said this a million times, but if I died today, I've had me a blast. I wouldn't trade my life for nobody's, but I don't know if I'd do it again. If somebody offered me a second round, I think I'd have to pass on it. If you or anyone you know is having suicidal thoughts, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK. Fans of Guns N' Roses know that they play from the heart, pulling lyrics from experiences rooted in addiction, pain, poverty, and abuse. This is the tragic, real-life story of one of history's greatest rock bands. This one is perhaps as unsurprising as it is tragic, but each and every single one of the Appetite for Destruction era band members came from a broken home. Drummer Steven Adler's father left the family when he was a kid. His resulting problematic behavior forced his mother to send him to his grandparents in Hollywood, where he met Saul Hudson. Hudson, popularly known as Slash, was also the child of divorced parents. They'd split in 1974 after years of trying to hold a marriage together while in separate countries. Like Adler, Slash neglected school and indulged in substance abuse. Naturally, the two decided to form a band. It never materialized, but they did search for a bassist long enough to meet one Michael Duff McKagan, a Seattle punk transplant with a passion for music and an addiction to alcohol. Duff's parents were also divorced. Meanwhile, Indiana natives Jeffrey Isabel, known as Izzy Stradlin, and childhood friend William Bailey, better known as Axl Rose, were also the products of broken homes. Stradlin's parents divorced when he was 8, while Axl's parents split when he was still 2. Axl has since described his childhood home as intensely religious, and he claims he and his siblings endured regular physical abuse as children. LA's Sunset Strip was, in the mid-'80s, a scene of both ascendant rock and roll glory and shattered dreams. For every Rat or Poison that went on to multi-platinum success, there were countless bands that called it a day after getting nowhere. Guns N' Roses is arguably the most legendary band to break out of this scene, but its constituent members were in multiple failed bands before forming their most famous group. For example, the band Road Crew, consisting of Slash, Steven Adler, and Duff, briefly sought a singer but disbanded in less than a year with no releases. Slash and Adler would later join Hollywood Rose, in which both Axl and Izzy Stradlin were playing. However, despite having 4 of Guns' later 5 classic members, this group would also fall apart before achieving any notable success. Then Rose and Stradlin would go on to join LA Guns. Unlike Road Crew and Hollywood Rose, LA Guns would in fact get a record deal and achieve moderate success at the tail end of the decade without either Rose or Stradlin. However, like Road Crew and Hollywood Rose, they're far more famous for being the band that contained future members of Guns N' Roses. After forming Guns N' Roses in 1985 and having a few practice sessions, the boys decided to launch their first West Coast tour. However, the absence of a working vehicle, money, ticket sales, or any reputation made for a rough time. The car the band did have, into which they packed all their gear, broke down a few hours north of LA and left them stranded. Unwilling to wait for repairs, they decided to abandon their heavier equipment and hitchhike to as many gigs as they could get to. When they got to Seattle, none of the very few patrons present in the bars they played in were interested in this scrappy, no-name outfit that reeked of beer and sweat. Unimpressed with the lack of business the band drew in, at least one club owner refused to pay until the boys cornered him in the back office and threatened significant bodily harm. The band then had to hitchhike back to LA with barely enough money for gas station food to get them there. However, several members have since cited the challenges of the so-called Hell Tour as what cemented their friendship. The Hell Tour may have been a brief baptism of fire for the band, but it wasn't exactly smooth sailing upon their return to LA. They had each other's backs, but no reputation, no money, and few connections. In short, they had to build a following from scratch. In his autobiography, Slash explains that Guns had to pay for club slots, exhausting much of the funds the band did collect at various odd jobs and forcing them to turn elsewhere for food and shelter. The group did manage to later rent a number of tiny spaces in which to crash and practice, but these places quickly became neighborhood hubs for out-of-control depravity and filth. Parties raged into the wee hours of the morning and spilled into the surrounding streets, attracting frequent police attention. Still, the band's financial problems persisted until they signed a lucrative deal with Geffen Records. Appetite for Destruction, the band's 1987 debut, took the world by storm when monster hits like Sweet Child of Mine and Welcome to the Jungle began getting regular radio and MTV video rotation roughly a year after the album's release. In Mick Wall's War, the unauthorized biography of Axl Rose, Tim Collins, the manager of Aerosmith for whom Guns was opening in 1988 when Appetite topped the charts, said, "They basically just exploded. Rolling Stone magazine showed up to do a story on Aerosmith, but Guns N' Roses ended up on the cover of the magazine. Suddenly, the opening act was bigger than we were." Months later, Guns N' Roses co-headlined England's Monsters of Rock festival. During Guns' performance, a moshing crowd of more than 100,000 repeatedly rushed the gate near the stage. Axl repeatedly stopped the set to demand they take several steps back. However, the music ultimately continued, and so did the chaos. After their set, the band learned 2 fans had indeed been killed. The group was devastated, but the media blamed them for the tragedy and slapped them with the moniker of, quote, the most dangerous band in the world. By the end of 1988, Guns N' Roses was one of the most popular bands on the planet, but with limitless money and fame came just as much, and often unwanted, media attention. The group released GNR Lies at the end of the year, an acoustic EP featuring the top 10 single Patience, which is still a staple of the band's live sets. However, it also featured One in a Million, a song with lyrics considered shocking and bigoted even at the time. Axl spent years dodging numerous accusations about his character in the aftermath of the album's release.
Guess what? I changed my point of view. For me now, it's kind of like live and let die.
In early 1990, Guns N' Roses won twice at the American Music Awards, with Slash and Duff accepting both awards. The bandmates were also thoroughly drunk and dropped so many curse words on live TV that their mics had to be cut. This was all in addition to ongoing coverage of the Monsters of Rock disaster, as well as bar fights, assaults, arrests, and even a proposed parking lot brawl between Axl and Motley Crue's Vince Neil over an allegation that Stradlin had hit on Neil's wife at a party. The fight never happened, according to Ultimate Classic Rock, but it got plenty of coverage. Even in a group as notoriously wild and permissive as Guns N' Roses, firings really did happen. The band had been alarmed at Steven Adler's deteriorating condition for some time before they pulled the trigger and released him. In 1990, the group returned to the stage after a break for what was supposed to be the warm-up show for a tour promoting their upcoming albums, Use Your Illusion 1 and 2. Adler, high, stumbled on the way to the drum riser in front of the whole crowd, humiliating and enraging a band that was quickly losing patience with him. It was the last show he'd ever play with Guns. In July 1990, he was formally fired, with Matt Sorum, then the drummer for The Cult, replacing him. In 1991, Adler sued the band for misleading him in various contracts, and he was awarded a substantial out-of-court sum. The Use Your Illusion double album was released in 1991 to immediate success and enormous fanfare. According to the New York Times, industry expectations put it on the same level as Michael Jackson. It largely delivered, too, selling 500,000 copies in 2 hours and having since sold a combined 35 million. With Matt Sorum on drums and keyboardist Dizzy Reed added to the roster at Axl's insistence, the band embarked on a 2.5-year-long world tour that was fraught with controversy. For example, there were riots, including the 1991 Riverport riot and another one in Montreal where the band shared a bill with Metallica that were spectacularly expensive and fully the fault of Axl Rose. Then there were the late starts where Rose often enraged the crowd by taking the stage hours after the band was scheduled to perform. And then there were the mid-set storm-offs by, you guessed it, Axl Rose. But things only got crazier from there. Izzy Stradlin, newly sober and unable to take the pressure and unending madness, left the band in 1991, while Duff, Matt, and Slash sank further and further into an abyss of alcohol abuse. Behind the scenes, late fees, police coverage, and excessive partying ensured the tour stayed heavily over budget and barely profitable for its duration. By 1992, the success of Nirvana had ushered in the grunge era and the end of bloated 80s glam rock. Guns N' Roses, which was far more popular than most of the bands associated with the subgenre, had survived the initial hairband winnowing in the early 90s. But by the time the Use Your Illusion tour finally lumbered to an end in 1993, even GNR couldn't escape the fact that the music world had changed forever. They released The Spaghetti Incident, a collection of punk rock covers, in late 1993 to lukewarm success. After that, clashing egos and dwindling relevancy led to intense turmoil in the ranks. Axl, increasingly acting like a corporate boss, strong-armed the other members into signing over their rights to the band's name to him. In 1996, Slash quit the group over increasing frustration with Axl's demands and the band's inability to record new music. Duff also left the following year, while Axl fired Matt Sorum. By 1998, he was the only original member remaining. After leaving Guns N' Roses, Slash, Duff, and Matt Sorum formed Velvet Revolver. Izzy Stradlin formed the Juju Hounds. Steven Adler played in several bands like the ongoing Adler's Appetite. Axl, meanwhile, who'd grown increasingly reclusive, soldiered on with his version of Guns N' Roses. His constant hiring and firing of various studio musicians like guitar virtuoso Buckethead and the Replacement's Tommy Stinson led many to think that the once triumphant rock band had been reduced to a never-ending revolving door of hired guns. The band was also continuing forward with plans to eventually release the long-awaited follow-up to the Use Your Illusion records titled Chinese Democracy. However, the album was constantly being tinkered with and ultimately delayed a number of times. After it was finally released in 2008, it received fairly positive reviews and sold a few million copies. But its legacy is far more centered around its outrageous costs, the inexcusable amount of time it took to release, and the eccentricities of Axl Rose during this period. Duff McKagan, bloated from years of drinking, nearly died in 1994 when his pancreas effectively exploded, leaking digestive enzymes into his body. In order to survive, he got sober and healthy. Slash briefly died from a heroin overdose during the Use Your Illusion tour, according to the BBC, but he was revived. In 2001, at age 35, he was diagnosed with congestive heart failure and given a month to live. However, he too sobered up, and with the help of a surgically implanted defibrillator, he's long since cleared his expected expiration date. Years later, after getting pneumonia at a Cher concert he attended and being forced off cigarettes for several weeks to recover, he decided to ride the momentum and kick that habit for good too. Steven Adler had spent the majority of the 90s plummeting further into drug addiction, even being arrested in 1995 for felony heroin possession. The next year, he suffered a stroke that left him with a permanent speech impediment. In the years since, drug-induced depression led him to attempt suicide on a number of occasions. Thankfully, Adler survived and is currently doing well. If you or anyone you know is having suicidal thoughts, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8255.
With hits like Talk Dirty to Me and Every Rose Has Its Thorn, Poison was one of the most widely successful hair metal rock bands of the 80s. However, life outside of the music wasn't always great. Here's the dark tale of Poison. In the late 1960s, 6-year-old future rock star Bret Michaels became increasingly and seriously ill. His parents took him to the emergency room, where doctors diagnosed him with type 1 diabetes, an autoimmune disease in which the body stops making insulin. Michaels was immediately placed on a daily regimen of multiple insulin shots. He was also told to frequently check his blood sugar levels with a finger-sticking device. For Michaels, managing his diabetes would require balance. If he takes too much insulin, his blood sugar drops and he can pass out. Sadly, this happened to the singer in the late 80s at a show in Madison Square Garden in New York City. Michaels didn't feel his blood sugar getting low, and he collapsed on stage as a result. Type 1 diabetes is a chronic condition with no cure. Michaels continues to deal with diabetes-related setbacks. In 2018, he tweeted that he'd been admitted to emergency rooms several times over the previous weeks because of diabetes-related kidney and heart issues. As the lead guitarist of Poison, CC DeVille was one of the driving forces behind the band's signature sound. But after years of unreliability, backstage fights, and substance abuse issues, the members of Poison decided they'd finally had enough of DeVille. After the release of Swallow This Live in 1991, Poison dismissed DeVille and replaced him with guitarist Richie Kotzen. DeVille didn't go away quietly, though. In 1992, Poison singer Bret Michaels guested on Pirate Radio Saturday Night, a nationally syndicated hard rock radio talk show hosted by Lon Friend. DeVille called the studio, and while Friend declined the guitarist's request to go on the air, he taped the ranting and raving call. Metal fans and radio insiders traded tapes of the conversation for months. Kotzen only lasted with Poison through 1993, with DeVille rejoining his old band in 1996. But following a summer tour in 1999, he was once again out of Poison due to creative differences. When asked about his decision to fire DeVille for a second time, Michaels had this to say: CC would only play the material he originally worked on. He just wanted to rehash the old Poison stuff and work on his new band. That new band, Samantha 7, also led to some animosity when Michaels and other members of the Poison family refused DeVille's insistence that Samantha 7 be the opening act on a planned summer 2000 tour. Richie Kotzen played on just one Poison album, 1993's Native Tongue, and toured with the band for a limited time, which he didn't enjoy. Kotzen told Electric Basement, "When I made the record, it was fun. Where it got to be a drag was when I had to play the old music." In retrospect, it didn't look like Kotzen would be with the group for the long haul anyway, and he further destroyed any good standing he had with the rest of Poison because of a choice he made in his personal life. According to Metal Edge, the band was about to hit the stage for a concert in Sacramento, California in July 1993, when drummer Ricky Rocket learned that his former fiancée, who had dumped him and called off their engagement earlier that year, had taken up with a new guy. You guessed it, Richie Kotzen. As a result, Kotzen was immediately tossed out of Poison. Along with the joys of being in a successful band, the pressures can get to its members, be they creative differences, the rigors of touring, or personal disagreements. For Poison, that tension erupted into fisticuffs on more than one occasion. On Fox Sports Radio's Steve Gorman Sports Show in 2015, singer Bret Michaels recalled the time he and guitarist CeCe DeVille got into it at a New Orleans sports bar after some drinking. Eventually, the two were physically separated. However, when DeVille and Michaels got back to the hotel, they started beating each other up once more. Another dust-up between DeVille and Michaels occurred in 1991 after Poison performed at the MTV Video Music Awards. During the band's performance, DeVille delivered a sloppy, error-plagued performance. Michaels was unhappy with DeVille's performance and let the guitarist know it. As a result, DeVille and Michaels came to blows after the show. Furthermore, fans who came to see Poison in Atlanta in 2006 were treated to an extra, non-musical encore. After getting into a verbal argument, singer Michaels and bassist Bobby Dahl engaged in physical violence. Michaels tossed his microphone at Dahl, and Dahl rammed his bass into Michaels' knee. Further damage was prevented when roadies and drummer Ricky Rocket broke up the fight. Writing about the incident on Poison's website, Bret Michaels had this to say: "That stuff has been building up for 20 years. We are like brothers, and sometimes brothers want to beat each other up." The hair metal bands of the 1980s and early 1990s were renowned for their legendarily hard-partying ways, as much as, or even more so, than they were for their unique brand of radio-friendly glam hard rock. The numerous pre-show parties, backstage parties, and after-concert parties got out of hand for some hair metal participants, such as longtime Poison bassist Bobby Dahl. The musician drank excessively during Poison's heyday, and one such example was preserved for posterity. In the music video for Every Rose Has Its Thorn, Dahl is so drunk that he can't even stand. Remarking on the video, Dahl told the Green Bay Press-Gazette, "There's a scene where you see me where I'm wasted and I fall down, and I'm literally being picked up by my guy that worked for me at the time. That scene, I am drunk and wasted in." In 1993, Dahl checked himself into a substance abuse rehabilitation facility, and today he identifies as an alcoholic and drug addict in recovery. In January 1997, Poison, a band not much in the news by that point anymore after the death of hair metal and the ascendancy of alternative rock, made some scary headlines. MTV News reported that Bret Michaels had hired a private investigator to look into the reasons behind increasing threats to his safety. Over the course of a few months in 1996, Michaels' Nashville home was set on fire, his dog had been killed, and his truck had been tampered with in such a way that a tire fell off while he was driving. Michaels believed that the meaning behind all of these assaults on his life and property was intimidation and revenge for his refusal to sell a video he'd once made with his former girlfriend, actress Pamela Anderson.
What are you doing here?
I'm looking for a light.
Just kidding. It wasn't anything as embarrassing as barbed wire. It was just a private video of them being intimate. Nevertheless, in 1998, a company called Internet Entertainment Group commercially released a video full of footage of Michaels and Anderson's intimate encounters, which it claims it obtained via, quote, a non-disclosed authorized source. Michaels didn't authorize the video, though, and according to his lawyer, spent $100,000 trying to prevent the tape's release, which may have been stolen and leaked by a former employee of Michaels. Poison drummer Ricky Rocket appeared on an edition of the SiriusXM hard rock-themed show Eddie Trunk Live in 2015, where he discussed his months-long ordeal in fighting cancer. After suffering from a severe sore throat in June of that year, Rocket sought medical attention. A biopsy at USC Medical Center indicated oral cancer, specifically a malignant tumor at the base of the drummer's tongue that had also spread to 2 nearby lymph nodes. This type of cancer is fortunately very treatable, but it's not pleasant. Rocket endured 9 rounds of intense chemotherapy, followed by 35 rounds of radiation. After effects included a rash and so many canker sores that even drinking water was painful. Rocket also divulged that his tongue cancer, in all likelihood, developed out of a case of the human papillomavirus, or HPV. In July 2016, just over 1 year after his initial diagnosis, Rocket received a clean bill of health.
I am a cancer survivor.
After virtually disappearing from mainstream pop culture by the mid-90s, hair metal bands like Poison were celebrated in the stage show Rock of Ages. The jukebox musical used pre-existing songs to tell its story set in LA's Sunset Strip rock clubs of the 1980s. Rock of Ages debuted on Broadway in 2009. The musical featured 2 Poison songs, and so the 2009 Tony Awards opened with Poison performing Nothing But a Good Time alongside Rock of Ages cast members. Bret Michaels rocked it out and got the theatrical elite pumped up for the evening. However, at the end of the song, Michaels attempted to walk off the stage only to be pummeled by a descending Broadway backdrop. The heavy signage knocked him flat out. As a result, Michaels suffered a fractured nose and needed 3 stitches in his lip. Michaels filed suit against the Tony Awards and broadcaster CBS in 2011, alleging that in addition to facial injuries, he had to cancel several concerts and suffered from neurological issues. The legal matter was settled out of court. According to ABC News, Bret Michaels suffered a string of alarming and potentially fatal medical emergencies in April 2010. Early in the month, Michaels was all set to take the stage for a concert in San Antonio when he fell suddenly and seriously ill. He planned to perform anyway, but was ultimately rushed to a local hospital instead, where he endured an emergency appendectomy. Michaels wrote on his website, "They told me that if I had gone on stage like I wanted to, my appendix likely would have ruptured and I could have died." About 2 weeks later, Michaels was recuperating at home when he heard what, quote, sounded like a handgun. The loud popping noise wasn't a bullet, it was something internal. After finding he couldn't think straight, speak correctly, or move his head, Michaels asked girlfriend Christy Gibson to take him to a hospital. Soon after, doctors diagnosed Michaels with a massive brain hemorrhage, which was causing the base of his brainstem to bleed. Michaels was subsequently listed in critical condition as doctors treated him. After spending some time in a physical therapy facility, however, Michaels made a full recovery. He told the Wall Street Journal,
"You know what happens to me in your life at that exact moment? What happens is I found more of a drive for life."
After the Tony Awards accident, emergency appendectomy, and brain hemorrhage in rapid succession in 2009 and 2010, Bret Michaels wasn't out of the medical woods quite yet. After noticing that the left side of his body had grown increasingly numb in the middle of shooting The Celebrity Apprentice, Michaels immediately returned to the Arizona medical facility where he'd been treated for the hemorrhage.
He was popular. Everybody loved Bret.
In May 2010, doctors diagnosed Michaels with a case of patent foramen ovale, or PFO. Put more simply, it's a small hole in the heart that forms when babies are in the womb. The hole helps to circulate blood, but almost always closes up after birth. In Michaels' case, however, the hole never closed. Michaels' PFO, discovered when he was in his late 40s, led to a stroke in which a blood clot traveled all the way to the singer's brain. Months later, in January 2011, Michaels successfully underwent surgery to permanently seal and fix the hole in his heart. Poison just might be one of the most sued bands in rock history, facing courtroom battles over nearly its entire history. In 1987, the head of media relations at Geffen Records sued Bret Michaels and Bobby Dahl for $1.1 million and filed a formal criminal complaint alleging battery after the duo dumped beer and ice water on her at an after-show party. Then, in 2011, a relatively obscure band called Kid Rocker sued Poison for allegedly stealing some of their songs more than 20 years earlier. According to The Hollywood Reporter, in 1984, Poison guitarist C.C. DeVille auditioned for Kid Rocker. Members Billy McCarthy and James Stonich gave him a tape of their songs, which they believe DeVille later stole and used as the basis for 4 Poison songs, including Talk Dirty to Me and I Won't Forget You. The suit, filed in Illinois federal court, alleged copyright infringement and named Poison, Capitol Records, and EMI Music as defendants. The lawsuit, however, was dismissed in 2013. Once again, Poison had survived.
Karen Carpenter, one half of the brother-sister duo The Carpenters and the velvet voice behind hits like Close to You and Top of the World, enjoyed a meteoric rise to fame in the 1970s, only to literally disappear before her fans' very eyes. This is the tragic real-life story of Karen Carpenter. Karen Carpenter was born in 1950 in New Haven, Connecticut. Her family moved to Downey, California when she was 13 years old. By then it was clear that her older brother Richard was a piano prodigy. It was also clear that he was their mother's favorite child. In an excerpt from the biography Little Girl Blue, The Life of Karen Carpenter, author Randy L. Schmidt suggests that Karen's struggle with both bulimia and anorexia was in part a direct response to knowing that her mother Agnes didn't really love her. Not like she loved Richard anyway. Karen couldn't control her mother's affections, but she could control her food intake.
It just seemed that she was determined to lose weight. She wanted to be thin like you see the models that everybody are.
The Irish Independent makes it clear that Agnes was more concerned with outward appearances than she was with Karen's mental health. In a therapy session following her first hospitalization for anorexia, Karen's family was asked to tell her they loved her. Her father and brother did so readily. Agnes, on the other hand, dodged the request and chastised the therapist for referring to her by her first name, a habit she considered tactless. Karen liked to sing and dance, but as a young girl, she never got the kind of encouragement and praise her brother did. When she joined Richard's band just after high school, she wasn't even considered for the front woman role. Instead, she was thrown behind the drum kit. When that band broke up is when Richard suggested to Karen they take on the world as a brother-sister duo. Their big break came quickly. In 1969, they signed with A&M Records, and while their first album, Offering, was a relative flop, their second, Close to You, was a triumph. They found themselves celebrated all over the country. Radio listeners loved the pair's gentle-on-the-ear sound, but Karen's voice, much more than Richard's tinkling of the ivories, took center stage. Richard, used to the spotlight, wasn't always thrilled with his sister's notoriety. In fact, he was quite jealous. According to Little Girl Blue, when Karen recorded a solo album in 1980, Richard ridiculed the record and the album was shelved. It wasn't released until after Karen's death in 1983. Karen started dieting when she was a teenager. At 5 foot 4 inches and 145 pounds, she was often told she looked chubby. She began her efforts to lose weight with the Stillman diet, a carb-restrictive plan on which she quickly lost 20 pounds. Soon, though, Karen moved on. She went on diet after diet, shedding pounds, hiring a personal trainer, and eventually resorting to taking laxatives, thyroid medication, and expectorants to maintain a trim figure. At first, friends were supportive of the weight loss. When she got down to 110 pounds from a high of 165, they told her she looked great. As Karen continued to shrink, though, people around her grew alarmed. Fans worried she might have cancer. According to Time, audience members audibly gasped when she came out on stage, her hip bones jutting through the thin gowns she preferred at the time. A critic with Variety ignored her performance and focused instead on her looks, while her own husband dismissed her as a, quote, bag of bones. Most of the people in Karen's support system thought she simply needed to consume more calories. No one understood that she was suffering from a very real disorder, anorexia nervosa. Her bandmate John Bettis admitted that he didn't even know how to pronounce anorexia until Karen had been suffering from it for 5 years, and that her issues with food came down not to weight, but to control.
There were rumors, though, that you were suffering from the Slimmer's disease, from anorexia nervosa. Is that right?
No, I was just pooped.
Anorexia was a way for Karen to exercise control over her own affairs, but because both medical and mental health professionals didn't know how eating disorders worked, it took longer than it should have for her to get the help she needed. By the time she did receive proper treatment, it was too late. The young woman who once saw herself as too fat was now being criticized for being too skinny. She simply could not win. Tragically, when in the winter of 1983 she began to pursue a healthier lifestyle, gradually regaining the weight she'd lost, her heart, damaged from years of near starvation and drug abuse, could not support her larger frame. In 1975, Richard and Karen were poised to head out on their very first world tour, the 50 dates of which sold out in a matter of hours. It soon became clear, however, that Karen was too ill to travel. Her weight had plummeted and she was spending 14 hours a day in bed. Karen's doctors at the time refused to let her take part in the tour and it was canceled. According to Little Girl Blue, Richard and Karen probably lost around $250,000 as a result. Karen was racked with guilt over the inconvenience suffered by her record company and, of course, ticket holders, all of whom had their purchase refunded. Had the tour taken place, it was almost certain to have been a record setter. Estimates suggested it would have grossed $1.2 million in 1975. On one hand, the anxiety over the cancellation was the last thing Karen needed. On the other, it was clear that she was too exhausted to handle the grueling nature of overseas touring. Richard and A&M executive Terry Ellis traveled to London and Tokyo to publicly apologize for the cancellation. During a press conference, Ellis blamed Karen and Karen's gender for the fallout. He said, "Girls just can't take that life without something going wrong." He later walked back the remark. Having achieved incredible professional success by her early 20s, Karen wanted only two things to make her life complete: true love and a family of her own. She thought she was getting exactly what she hoped for in Thomas Burris, a 39-year-old real estate developer she met in June of 1980. She and Burris had a whirlwind romance, and much to the shock and dismay of some of Karen's friends, they decided to marry that August. Burris was handsome and, judging by his lavish lifestyle, very successful. Karen was completely infatuated. The infatuation didn't last long. According to The Guardian, Burris confessed just days before the wedding to having had a vasectomy years earlier. Karen was distraught. She'd hoped Burris would make her a mother. She called her own mother, Agnes, to tell her the wedding was off. Agnes, however, was more concerned with the money she'd personally spent on the upcoming nuptials. She told her she had made her bed and should lie in it. And lie in it Karen did. She submitted meekly to Burris's physical and mental abuse and watched helplessly as he drained her bank account. She ended the marriage after barely a year, brokenhearted, childless, and robbed not only of her fortune, but her belief in love. As if Karen's story wasn't sad enough, she also had to contend with obsessed fans honing into her private life. She referred to the more difficult cases as, quote, the strangies, and said, "They ask for advice that I'm not capable of giving because I'm not a doctor. It's hard to tell someone how to live their life even if you know them, let alone if you've never seen them." At one performance in Dallas, a man rushed the stage and sat down at Karen's drum kit. When it was clear he was a crasher, police escorted him from the stage. He fought them the whole way, insisting he was Karen's fiancé. He was only the tip of the iceberg. At the height of the Carpenters' popularity, an endless line of men randomly showed up at Karen's parents' home in Downey, California, asking for her. One ended his vigil by screaming her name over and over again. But what seemed to weigh most heavily on Carpenter's thin shoulders was serving as a role model for young people. She told Rolling Stone, we only wanted to make a little music." One of the saddest facts of Karen's melancholy life is that when she died in 1983 of heart failure, she seemed to be on the mend. According to the biography The Carpenters, the untold story, unauthorized biography, the day before she died could not have been more typically boring and suburban. She'd spent the day shopping for a washer-dryer and the evening with her parents. The three of them had dinner at Big Boy and then settled in to watch bad TV together. Conspicuously absent from her final hours was the drama surrounding what her family referred to as her, quote, over-dieting. She even ate a few tacos while she watched TV. At the time, she was a healthy 110 pounds, up from the 80 she weighed during her last hospital stay. Her brother had every reason to believe she was on her way to recovery after an 8-year battle with anorexia. He and Karen were in the midst of recording their 12th album, Voice of the Heart. Karen died on the floor of her room in her parents' California home. Her heart, weakened from years of starvation, dieting, and abuse of the expectorant Ipecac, finally gave out. In the 70s, the Carpenters were, to borrow the title of one of their most popular tunes, on top of the world. They'd taken over the radio waves with a squeaky clean slate of hits like Close to You, Superstar, and We've Only Just Begun, and they scored a couple of Grammy Awards. The brother-sister duo were steadily gaining a loyal fan base thanks to their easy listening style and Karen's smooth-as-molasses contralto. Then the 80s hit, and their popularity began to wane, partially because both Richard and Karen were fighting private demons, in his case an addiction to Quaaludes, and in hers anorexia nervosa. But they were also facing a very real shift in the public's musical taste. Hair bands and heavy metal were in, sweet tunes about birds magically appearing and newfound love were out. Regardless of who was to blame for the Carpenters' star falling, music fans continued to disagree about their legacy. While many weigh in on the side that they were too cheesy to be taken seriously, the other side, which includes Paul McCartney and Rolling Stone, swear that they were the real deal. In 1989, 6 years after Karen's death, CBS released the made-for-TV movie The Karen Carpenter Story. As time makes clear, the docudrama, while largely enjoyable, refuses to dig very deeply into the nuances of Karen's too short life.
Come on, you said I was in charge.
No, not about my pizza.
I'm doing you a favor. In 10 or 20 years, Mom or Dad are going to let you date, and you don't want to get fat, do you?
The movie ends with Karen smiling into the camera. So even though she's about to die on the floor of her room, all's right in the world? Some critics think she got better treatment in Todd Haynes' pull-no-punches, Barbie-helmed short Superstar: The Karen Carpenter Story. Yes, Karen is Barbie and Richard is Ken. The other characters are likewise portrayed by dolls. Superstar takes aim at Richard Nixon, whom the Carpenters performed for while the Vietnam War raged, as well as Agnes and the, quote, fascism that lies at the heart of American capitalism. Richard Carpenter successfully sued Haynes in 1990 for using several Carpenter songs without permission and for suggesting Richard might have been a closeted homosexual. As a result, the film is now banned. In January 2017, Richard Carpenter also sued his and Karen's former record company A&M and Universal Music Group for cheating them, well, him, out of the royalties associated with digital downloads. According to Variety, Carpenter took the companies to task for breach of contract, arguing that he'd only received a, quote, minuscule fraction of the digital royalties owed him. Chalking up the issue to multiple accounting errors on the part of A&M and Universal, Richard asked the court to reward him and Karen's estate $2 million in compensatory damages. Richard based part of his argument on the success he and Karen shared with their record companies, saying, "The Carpenters' recordings are among the best sellers in the history of popular music, and after 48 years continue to contribute a substantial amount to UMG/AM's annual bottom line. It only seems fair that these companies account fairly to my sister's estate and to me." The case was settled out of court. No terms were divulged.
Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.